Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a dream. The second time, a coincidence. By the third night, I knew something was terribly wrong with my mattress, or worse, with my mind. I'm not a superstitious man. I'm an architectural engineer who believes in structural integrity, measurable forces, and rational explanations. But what's happening in my bedroom defies every principle of physics I've ever known, and it's getting worse. It started 3 weeks ago after I moved into this century-old brownstone in Providence. The previous owner, an elderly professor, had left abruptly, selling it for well below market value. The real estate agent mentioned something about health issues, but her tight smile suggested otherwise. I didn't push. The price was too good to question. The house came partially furnished, including a surprisingly comfortable mattress in the master bedroom. Memory foam, I assumed, though the tag had been removed. It conformed perfectly to my body, especially when I slept on my stomach, my preferred position. Too perfectly, as I would soon discover. During the first week, I slept better than I had in years. My chronic back pain faded. I attributed it to the mattress's support, mentally congratulating myself on my lucky find. By the second week, something changed. I began waking up with the distinct sensation of pressure on my back. Not the passive pressure of gravity, but active, kneading pressure, like fingers working methodically along my spine. The sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant. In fact, it relieved tension I didn't know I carried. I rationalized it as muscle memory, my body responding to the foam's contours. Then came the night I first resisted. I was half asleep when I felt the now familiar pressure begin. In my drowsy state, I rolled onto my side, away from the sensation. The mattress seemed to respond. I felt a gentle but insistent tug, pulling me back toward my stomach. When I resisted further, the tugging strengthened. Then came a series of sharp pops along my rib cage, my vertebrae realigning with painful satisfaction. I gasped, fully awake now, heart hammering against my chest. The room was silent. Moonlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting striped shadows across the empty floor. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but me. I sat up, switching on the bedside lamp with trembling fingers. The mattress appeared normal, innocuous even, its surface already rising where my weight had compressed it. I slept on the couch that night, telling myself I was being irrational. The next morning, while showering, I noticed the marks. Symmetrical red impressions stretched across my back in a precise grid pattern. They didn't hurt, but they pulsed slightly under my fingers, warm to the touch. They resembled thermal imaging patterns, methodical, purposeful. By evening, they had faded, and I convinced myself they were simply pressure marks from sleeping awkwardly on the couch. I returned to the bedroom that night, determined to prove to myself that my imagination had run wild. I even took a sleeping pill, hoping to bypass any midnight paranoia. It was a mistake. The pill trapped me in a state of partial consciousness, aware but immobile. I felt the mattress shift beneath me, not just conforming to my weight, but actively reshaping itself. The pressure returned, more insistent than before. It started at my shoulders, systematically working down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only lie there as the mattress seemed to study my body's architecture, memorizing every curve and joint. I became aware of a subtle sound, a soft, rhythmic whisper, almost like breathing, but too mechanical, too deliberate. It synchronized with the pressure patterns moving across my back. My lungs constricted in response, involuntarily matching this external rhythm. I was being ventriloquized by my own bed. When dawn finally broke, ending my paralysis, I stumbled to the bathroom on unsteady legs. The marks had returned, deeper now, forming an intricate pattern that extended from my shoulders to my waist. They throbbed in unison, like a secondary pulse. I took a photo with my phone, then watched in disbelief as the image distorted, the pattern blurring until it was unrecognizable. 3 attempts yielded the same result. I needed evidence, validation, proof that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. That afternoon, I purchased a digital scale and weighed the mattress, 97.4 pounds. I recorded this in a notebook, feeling ridiculous yet desperate for empirical data. I slept in the guest room that night, door locked, a chair wedged under the handle for good measure. My sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of sinking into soft surfaces that whispered my name. Morning revealed new marks, fainter, but undeniably present, despite having avoided the master bedroom entirely. My skin crawled with the implication. I returned to the master bedroom and weighed the mattress again. 106.2 pounds, an increase of 8.8 pounds overnight. My breath caught in my throat, heart skipping painfully. Something was fundamentally wrong. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching. I found nothing helpful. Memory foam manufacturing processes, off-gassing concerns, dust mite accumulation. Nothing that explained what was happening. I considered sharing my experience online, but stopped myself. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. That evening, a package arrived, a new mattress I'd ordered at premium cost for overnight delivery. I dragged the old one into the hallway, its weight seemingly shifting as I moved it, making it alternately heavier and lighter, as if it were resisting and then helping. My skin prickled with revulsion. I installed the new mattress, a traditional spring model, and slept soundly for the first time in days. The following night passed uneventfully as well. By the third night, I'd begun to relax, attributing my experience to some combination of stress, an old mattress with deteriorating chemicals, and an overactive imagination. Then I noticed the old mattress still sitting in my hallway. I'd meant to dispose of it, but somehow hadn't gotten around to it. Its presence now seemed accusatory, waiting. I decided to examine it properly in daylight to prove to myself that it was just an ordinary object. I dragged it to the backyard and cut through the outer fabric with a utility knife. The material parted with surprising ease, releasing a faint scent like ozone after a thunderstorm. Inside, instead of the expected foam layers, I found a peculiar structure. The interior material had formed a distinct pattern, a human silhouette composed of densely compacted fibers. My silhouette, complete with the subtle asymmetry of my left shoulder, which sits slightly higher than my right due to an old injury. The arms of this fiber sculpture were extended outward, palms up, in a posture that suggested worship or control. I dropped the knife, my mouth desert dry, heart beating so violently I could see my shirt moving. A rational voice in my mind suggested a simple explanation. Body impressions happen in old mattresses. This was just an extreme version, perhaps accelerated by the humid New England climate. But another part of me recognized the deliberate artistry in what I was seeing. This wasn't random compression. This was sculpture. I photographed it, hands shaking so badly I had to brace against the fence. This time, the images remained stable. Evidence at last. Though of what? I wasn't entirely sure. I decided to remove the mattress from my property entirely. I loaded it into my SUV and drove to an industrial waste facility at the edge of town. The attendant barely glanced at me as I paid the disposal fee. I dragged the mattress to the designated area, fighting the irrational urge to apologize to it. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a wet, sighing sound, like air escaping long-sealed chambers. I froze, every hair on my body rising in primordial warning. Slowly, I turned back. The mattress seemed to deflate before my eyes, not in the usual way of escaping air, but deliberately, as if exhaling. Then came the voice, not audible in the conventional sense, but felt, resonating in my skull like feedback. Nosage. My name, backward. The sound crawled through my mind like ice water, familiar yet hideously wrong. Before I could react, the entire mattress collapsed into itself, disintegrating into a fine, shimmering powder that caught the sunlight like crushed opals. I stumbled backward, tripping over discarded construction materials. The powder moved, swirling slightly despite the absence of wind, then settled. By the time a worker responded to the noise of my fall, nothing remained but a faint iridescent residue, which he attributed to leaking chemicals from nearby waste. I've moved to a hotel while I reconsider my options. The marks on my back have faded, but occasionally pulse in synchronized patterns, especially at night. I've seen 3 doctors. The first prescribed anxiety medication, the second suggested a sleep study. The third, an older man who studied the marks in silence for a long time, asked if I'd recently acquired any antiques, then refused to elaborate. Last night, I awoke to find myself on my stomach, despite having fallen asleep on my back. The hotel mattress beneath me felt different, denser, more responsive. When I shifted position, I felt the familiar, gentle resistance, followed by that awful, satisfying adjustment of my spine. I checked out immediately, telling the bewildered night clerk there was a plumbing issue in my room. Now I'm sitting in my car, watching the sun rise over the city, wondering where I can go, what I should do, because I've just realized something that turns my blood to ice. I never told anyone my name at the waste facility. There was no way for the mattress to know it, unless it had already been inside my head all along. I haven't slept in 3 days. I can't. Every surface feels suspect. Yielding materials repulse me. I catch myself pressing against hard surfaces, walls, floors, the hood of my car, anything that doesn't give, doesn't conform, doesn't learn. The new mattress still sits in my bedroom at home, waiting. I drove by yesterday but couldn't bring myself to go inside. Through the window, I swear I saw a depression on its surface, a human-shaped indentation, as if someone were lying there, as if it were waiting for me to come home. Story 2. The first time I saw a paint can float, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. The second time, I knew I was losing my mind. By the third time, I understood that something in that house didn't want us to change its colors. I just wish I had listened sooner. My father met Elaine 6 months after my mother left. I didn't resent her presence in his life. He deserved happiness after everything, but I kept my distance. When she called asking for help renovating her Victorian home, I agreed only because my father insisted. "She's trying, son," he had said, his voice carrying that pleading tone he'd developed since Mom's departure. I couldn't say no to that voice. The house sat at the end of Marshfield Road, a looming 3-story structure with peeling gray paint and windows that seemed to watch you approach. Elaine had inherited it from her aunt, she explained as she led me through rooms filled with drop cloths and the sharp smell of primer. The previous owners had lived there for 60 years before passing. The real estate agent had mentioned something about unresolved disputes between the elderly couple, but Elaine had dismissed it as irrelevant gossip. The renovation started smoothly. We began with the living room, a spacious area with high ceilings and ornate crown molding. Elaine wanted a warm terracotta for the walls. I suggested a more neutral beige. That's when it happened, the first incident I tried so desperately to rationalize. The paint can, sealed and untouched on the plastic-covered floor, rose 6 inches into the air and hovered. My heart skipped several beats as sweat immediately beaded across my forehead. I blinked hard, and when my eyes opened, the can sat innocently on the floor again. Elaine hadn't noticed, occupied with measuring the wall. I said nothing, convinced my sleep-deprived brain had momentarily glitched. We compromised on a soft amber tone. As I pried open the can, the paint inside wasn't the color we'd purchased. Instead, a deep crimson substance filled the container, its consistency thicker than paint should be. I showed Elaine, who frowned, and insisted we'd been given the wrong color. When we returned from the hardware store with a replacement, the original can contained the correct amber paint. We laughed nervously about it, blaming poor mixing at the store. The work proceeded for 3 days without incident. Then came our disagreement about the dining room. Elaine envisioned a deep forest green. I argued for something lighter, a sage that wouldn't darken the already shadowy space. The argument wasn't heated, just a difference in aesthetic opinion. But as our voices raised slightly, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. 3 paint cans lifted simultaneously, hovering at chest height. My voice caught in my throat, pulse hammering in my ears. Elaine followed my gaze and gasped. We watched, paralyzed, as paint splashed upward from the open cans, defying gravity. The droplets coalesced in midair, forming what looked like faces, incomplete faces lacking mouths, with empty eye sockets that wept trails of blood-red paint down invisible cheeks. The cans crashed to the floor in perfect unison. Neither of us moved for several long moments. The spilled paint, which should have spread randomly across the drop cloth, formed precise letters. Repents. Elaine broke the silence, her voice trembling as she suggested we were both overworked. I agreed too quickly, desperate for any explanation that didn't involve acknowledging what we'd witnessed. We decided on a different color altogether, a light blue-gray that felt like compromise. Nothing floated that day, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched as we painted, brush strokes followed by unseen eyes. The kitchen renovation brought new manifestations. We chose a buttercream yellow that felt cheerful and uncontroversial. As I rolled the first stroke onto the wall, the paint separated into hundreds of tiny droplets that hung suspended before rearranging themselves into a pattern, a perfect silhouette of 2 figures embracing. I recognized Elaine's profile immediately. The other was unmistakably me. My stomach knotted as I stared at the impossible image of intimacy between us, something that had never occurred, would never occur. Elaine didn't comment on the resemblance, but her hands shook as she continued painting another section. The silhouette absorbed into the wall, disappearing as though it had never existed. That night, I dreamed of walking through the house, each room painted in shades of crimson that dripped constantly, the liquid too thick and warm to be paint. We decided to simplify, pure white for the remaining rooms, a neutral choice that surely couldn't provoke whatever force was manipulating our renovation. We were wrong. The poltergeist activity escalated dramatically. Paint rollers flew across the room, shattering windows. Brushes twisted into impossible knots. And everywhere we tried to apply the white paint, it was immediately covered with black silhouettes of Elaine and me, embracing, holding hands, dancing, always in poses of intimacy that felt violating in their impossibility. Elaine reluctantly mentioned installing security cameras. I agreed, though neither of us acknowledged what we were really looking for. The first night's footage changed everything. At 3:17 a.m., the silhouettes appeared on the walls, but they weren't static. They moved, peeling themselves from the painted surfaces, 3-dimensional shadows that walked from room to room with unnatural, fluid movements. They paused at the doorway to my temporary bedroom, then Elaine's. The footage showed them entering both rooms. I couldn't breathe watching what happened next. The shadow figures stood over our sleeping forms, extending impossibly long fingers to trace patterns on our unconscious faces. The movements were almost tender, like artists working on delicate portraits. I felt violated and terrified in equal measure, my mouth dessert dry as I rewound and replayed the footage 3 times. When I checked my face in the mirror after viewing the footage, I found no trace of paint. Elaine reported the same. Yet the smell of solvent hung heavy throughout the house, strong enough to make my eyes water. We didn't speak much that day, working in tense silence. By the second week, my sleep was fractured by nightmares of drowning in paint that filled my lungs with burning cold. I'd wake gasping, the smell of solvent so powerful. I became convinced it wasn't just in the air. It was inside me, replacing my blood with paint thinner that stripped away my reason. My hands trembled constantly. Eating became an afterthought. The nightly recordings grew more disturbing. The shadow figures now spent hours painting invisible patterns on our sleeping bodies, and each night they lingered longer. Each morning, the smell of solvent grew stronger, though no physical evidence remained. I began to feel marked, claimed by something I couldn't understand. Elaine suggested abandoning the project. I agreed immediately, relief flooding through me. We would leave the remaining rooms as they were. Perhaps that would satisfy whatever presence had attached itself to the renovation. That night, I woke to the sensation of cold, wet traces being drawn across my forehead. My eyes snapped open to darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand before my face. Yet I felt the pressure of fingers, long, thin, inhuman, sliding across my skin with deliberate purpose. Paralyzed with terror, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, I lay motionless as invisible fingers painted patterns across my face, down my neck, over my chest. The smell of solvent burned my nostrils, filled my lungs until each breath felt toxic. When morning finally came, I found Elaine already in the kitchen, her face ashen. Without speaking, she showed me her phone. She had installed a secondary camera app that connected to her device. The night footage showed the shadow figures more clearly than the security system had. They weren't just random silhouettes. They were perfect reproductions of a photograph I'd seen in the basement. An elderly couple, the previous owners, locked in an embrace. Beneath the photograph, barely visible in our flashlight's beam days earlier, someone had written a single word: repents. I felt a sudden, horrible clarity. The house wasn't haunted by what had happened, but by what hadn't. By choices unmade, by words unspoken, by regret. That afternoon, we found a hidden compartment behind a loose baseboard in the master bedroom. Inside lay 2 sealed paint cans and a yellowed envelope. The letter inside, written in shaky handwriting, told a story of 60 years of silent unhappiness. Of colors chosen to please one spouse while the other swallowed their preference. Of small resentments calcified into silent hatred. Of 2 people who slept beside each other for decades without ever touching, without ever saying what they truly wanted or needed. We painted over our truth until we forgot what it looked like. The letter concluded, "Don't make our mistake." The paint cans contained 2 colors: the terracotta Elaine had originally wanted for the living room, and the sage green I had suggested for the dining room. We made our decision without discussion. The next day we began repainting each room, choosing colors we both genuinely liked, speaking honestly about our preferences without compromise for the sake of false peace. The floating stopped. The silhouettes disappeared from both walls and cameras. The smell of solvent faded. On my last day helping with the renovation, Elaine and I stood in the completed living room, admiring the terracotta walls that somehow made the space feel both warmer and larger. She thanked me sincerely, not just for the labor, but for helping her face whatever had been trapped in the house. I found myself thanking her too, though I couldn't fully articulate why. That night I dreamed of the elderly couple, not as shadowy silhouettes, but as young people laughing as they painted a room together, color splashing onto their clothes and faces. They turned toward me briefly, their expressions peaceful, before returning to their work, brushstrokes applying the exact colors Elaine and I had chosen. I still help Elaine with projects around the house occasionally. My father seems pleased by our developing friendship. Neither of us ever mentions what happened during those weeks, though sometimes I catch her glancing at the walls with a questioning look, as if wondering whether we truly understand what we experienced. I don't claim to comprehend it fully myself, but I've become more attentive to the colors I choose for my own life, the words I speak, the truths I tell, the emotions I express rather than bury. I've started painting as a hobby, finding unexpected peace in watching colors blend and transform, and I never use white to cover mistakes in my artwork. Instead, I incorporate them, allowing the painting to become something new. Some nights I still wake with the phantom sensation of fingers tracing patterns on my skin, but it no longer terrifies me. It reminds me that we are all works in progress, our lives constantly being repainted, and that the most important choice is whether we allow others to see our true colors. I just wish the previous owners had realized that before spending 60 years drowning in solvent, painting over their truth until they themselves became nothing but shadows. Story 3. The sound of wood scraping against tile isn't supposed to wake the dead. But as I lay rigid in my bed, sweat-drenched sheets clinging to my skin, I swore I could feel something stirring beneath the floorboards, something ancient and patient, awakened by that simple, grating rhythm that had become my nightly torment. I've always been methodical, borderline obsessive about order. My kitchen, like everything else in my life, remains immaculate. Counters wiped clean, dishes put away, chairs tucked neatly under the solid oak table I inherited from my grandmother. There's comfort in knowing exactly where everything belongs, or at least, there used to be. 3 weeks ago, thirst pulled me from a dreamless sleep. Digital clock glowing 3:07 a.m. I shuffled down the hallway toward the kitchen, my mind fogged with the heavy weight of interrupted sleep. I didn't bother with the lights at first. The pale moonlight streaming through the windows was enough to guide me to the sink. That's when I noticed it. A strange heaviness in the air, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling with a primal fear I couldn't yet name. The 4 wooden kitchen chairs stood arranged in a perfect circle under the chandelier. Not haphazardly pushed back, not slightly misaligned as might happen if someone had been sitting there, a mathematically precise circle, as if measured and placed by an architect's hand. I froze, water glass forgotten, as the impossible scene before me registered. I lived alone. Had for years since the divorce. No one had been in my house. The doors were locked, windows secured, alarm system armed. Yet there they were, 4 chairs, waiting like silent sentinels for some midnight congregation. As I stood paralyzed in the doorway, the unthinkable happened. The circle began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the chairs started rotating clockwise, their wooden legs scraping against the tile with a sound like rusted gears. No wind, no vibration, no rational explanation, just 4 inanimate objects moving of their own accord, gaining speed with each rotation. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A hallucination from sleep deprivation, perhaps an earthquake tremor too subtle to feel, but strong enough to create this bizarre illusion. But the steady mechanical motion continued, building to a pace that mimicked the frantic beating of my heart. I should have run, should have bolted from my house, called for help, done anything other than what I did next. But curiosity, that damned human instinct that horror movies always warn against, propelled me forward. I reached out, fingers extending toward the nearest chair back. Contact brought immediate regret. The wood felt warm, alive, pulsing beneath my fingertips. But worse was the sensation that shot up my arm, the unmistakable feeling of vertebrae snapping into place, a spinal column rearranging itself beneath my touch. My knees buckled as nausea flooded my system, sending me crashing to the floor. The chairs stopped their rotation abruptly, settling into a new configuration, splayed outward like the petals of some wooden flower, leaving the center of their circle exposed. That's when I noticed the chalk. There was no rational way it could have appeared there. Yet a pristine piece of school chalk now rested on my kitchen table. Beside it, scrawled in jagged, urgent letters, "Sit in the center." My entire body rebelled against the command. Every cell screamed danger. I crawled backward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever presence had invaded my home. The smell hit me then, clinical, sharp, the unmistakable odor of formaldehyde that brought back memories of high school biology class and preserved specimens floating in cloudy jars. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and huddled against the headboard until morning light filtered through the curtains. Daybreak brought momentary relief. The chairs back in their proper places. No chalk, no message, no evidence of the night's disturbance. I almost convinced myself it had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. Almost. But that smell remained. Faint but persistent. A chemical undertone to the familiar sense of my home. And that night, at precisely 3:07 a.m., I watched in horror as the second hand on my bedroom wall clock suddenly accelerated, spinning forward until it had advanced exactly 23 minutes. In the silence that followed, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of wood sliding against tile, coming from behind my locked kitchen door. I've started sleeping at hotels, returning home only during daylight hours to gather fresh clothes or necessary documents. My colleagues have noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the jumpy way I react to sudden movements. My boss suggested I take a leave of absence, concern etched on his face as he asked if everything was all right at home. I nodded, muttering something about insomnia, and promised to see a doctor. How could I explain that my kitchen furniture had developed a taste for midnight rituals? That each night, whether I was present or not, My wall clock jumped forward exactly 23 minutes. That something was waiting for me to complete the circle, to take the seat that had been so carefully prepared. Last night, desperation drove me to set up a camera before fleeing to another anonymous hotel room. This morning, with shaking hands, I reviewed the footage. The recording showed my empty kitchen, chairs in their proper places. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the frame flickered, just digital static, lasting less than a second. When the image cleared, the chairs formed their perfect circle. They began to rotate, faster than I remembered, the wood seeming to bend and stretch in ways that defied physical properties. Another flicker of static, and the chairs splayed open. The chalk appeared. Then, at the edge of the frame, just barely visible, a shadow moved along the wall, elongated, distorted, distinctly not human. The logical part of my brain insists there must be an explanation. Carbon monoxide poisoning causing hallucinations, a gas leak, a brain tumor pressing against my visual cortex. I've checked for all these things, installed new detectors, visited doctors who ran tests and found nothing physically wrong with me. One well-meaning psychiatrist suggested I might be experiencing extreme stress reactions, prescribed medication I've been too afraid to take. What if it dulls my senses when I need them most? Tonight marks 3 weeks since it began. I've returned home, determined to confront whatever has invaded my life. The formaldehyde smell has grown stronger, clinging to my clothes and hair. I've pulled out an old voice recorder, speaking these words as I wait for 3:07 a.m. to arrive. Maybe someone will find this and understand what happened to me. Maybe there will be a record of my sanity before whatever comes next. My research has yielded little concrete information, just fragmented forum posts about similar occurrences in older homes. One account mentioned furniture arrangements changing overnight, followed by unexplained smells and time distortions. The writer believed their house had become a focal point for something trying to cross over, something that needed a human participant to complete the connection. The theory feels uncomfortably plausible as I sit here, watching the minute hand creep toward the appointed hour. I've salted the doorways and windows, placed protective symbols from half a dozen religious traditions around the kitchen threshold. These desperate measures offer little comfort as the wall clock ticks relentlessly forward. 3:06 a.m. My mouth is desert dry, heart hammering so violently I fear it might crack my ribs. I can hear something moving in the kitchen now. Not just the scrape of chairs, but something else. A wet, organic sound like meat being tenderized. 3:07 a.m. The second hand has begun its accelerated journey. I can feel the wrongness of it, time stretching and compressing in ways it was never meant to. I'm approaching the kitchen now, recorder clutched in my sweating palm. The chairs are already positioned, rotating slowly, their wooden frames bending at impossible angles. The smell of formaldehyde is overwhelming now, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. Through tears, I can see the chalk on the table, the message now expanded. Sit in the center, become the conduit. Behind the rotating chairs, the kitchen wall seems to bulge inward, as if something massive is pressing against it from the other side. I understand now what's happening, why my home was chosen, why this ritual must be completed. I've pieced together the history of this land, the asylum that stood here a century ago, the experiments performed on patients in the name of science. My house stands on the site of the former operating theater, where consciousness was treated as malleable as clay. The doctors never stopped their work. They merely changed their approach after death, seeking new vessels to continue their explorations of the human mind. My orderly nature, my obsession with precision, these made me the perfect candidate. I won't sit in that center, won't become their gateway back into this world. As the chairs spin faster, I'm backing away, preparing to leave this place forever. Let them find another conduit. Let them... Wait. Something's changing. The chairs are slowing, their circle widening as if making room for something else. The wall behind them has stopped its unnatural movement, settling back into normal dimensions. Perhaps my refusal has weakened whatever force is at work here. Perhaps... No. The chairs aren't stopping. They're rearranging themselves into a new pattern, A straight line leading from where I stand to the center of the kitchen. An invitation. A path. And now I understand the true horror of my situation. I've been asking the wrong question all along. It was never about whether I would sit in the center, but about the realization that I've been sitting there all along. This kitchen, this house, my entire life has been constructed around me. A carefully orchestrated environment designed to prepare me for this moment. The doctors didn't need me to sit in their circle. They needed me to recognize that I've never left their operating table. The clock isn't advancing time. It's counting down, returning me to the moment when my consciousness was first spliced and redistributed. 23 minutes. The exact duration of the procedure according to the records I found buried in county archives. As this realization settles over me, the chairs freeze in place. The formaldehyde smell vanishes, replaced by something worse. The scent of my own fear, my own sweat, my own humanity being slowly erased. The kitchen door swings shut, and I hear wood sliding against tile one final time. I won't escape this. Not completely, but perhaps, if I leave enough breadcrumbs, this recording, the research notes hidden in my office, the symbols I've carved into the foundation of the house, someone might understand what happened here, might prevent it from happening again. For now, I have only one option. I must find the seams in their construct, the places where their reality bleeds into the true world. I will not sit in their center. I will not become their conduit. But I will find my way back to myself, even if I have to dismantle this false world piece by piece. The wall clock's hands have stopped their unnatural progression. For the first time in 3 weeks, time moves as it should. It's a small victory, but it's mine. And in this battle of wills, against forces that have had a century to perfect their methods, I'll take whatever advantage I can find. Tomorrow, I begin the dismantling, starting with 4 wooden chairs that know far too much about the architecture of my mind. Story 4. The moment my sister asked if she could use the guest room for a couple of nights, something in her voice made my skin crawl. She insisted that its air conditioner was quieter than her own, almost as if silence had become an obsession she couldn't shake. I remember standing in the hallway, the musty scent of old carpet mingling with the cool breath of the AC vents, feeling a jolt of unease that made my pulse quicken. The house was quiet then, far too quiet. Even the usual hum of machinery felt muffled, as if all the appliances were holding their breath, waiting for something unspeakable to stir awake in the shadows. I was already unsettled by the way the lights flickered that evening. Each bulb seemed to tremble at my slightest movement, throwing dancing shapes on the walls. The hallway felt narrower, the air heavier. My sister was adamant she needed the guest room because her own air conditioner kept producing loud, erratic clanking noises. Yet her face showed no sign of annoyance or complaint, only an odd determination, as if she knew the bigger challenge was outside her bedroom, lurking in the hush beyond the walls. I decided I would try to keep things normal. I spent the rest of the day tidying up, trying to drive away that nagging sense of disquiet. A headache had started pulsing behind my eyes. The tension in my neck radiated down my spine, and each time I heard a small creak in the floorboards, my heart gave a traitorous leap. I found myself checking the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. It felt like the house was testing me, as if it wanted to see if I would maintain composure or crumble under the weight of some intangible threat. That night, after my sister settled into the guest room, I drifted off on the living room couch while some late-night sports recap murmured from the TV. The next thing I recall was the sudden absence of light. The power must have gone out, or so I assumed. There was a soft static in the air, like the faint hiss one hears when the radio station is losing its signal. My heart hammered, and a slick of cold sweat coated my palms. Then I heard it, a sound that seemed to emerge from every corner of the house, vibrating the walls and the very floor beneath me. It was a low, metallic growl that pulsed like a broken engine failing to start. I felt the couch tremble in rhythm with the noise. The wooden floorboards rippled under my feet as I got up, a rolling wave of movement like a tide under old planks. Light bulbs in every lamp flickered in unison, as though they were being forced to mimic the sound. I froze, fear gnawing at my stomach, my breath tightening in my chest. I tried to think logically. Maybe a transformer had malfunctioned, or an electrical surge was distorting the circuits. But the more I listened, the more it sounded alive. An entity of raw frequency that had slithered into the house through the wiring. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, struggling to keep my hands steady. The air was thick, almost greasy, and I felt as though I was pushing through invisible cobwebs just across the living room. My sister called to me through the door, her voice muffled. She sounded distressed but not panicked, just deeply uneasy. I could almost picture her pressed against the door, listening to the same chilling vibration that made my teeth clatter. When the power returned moments later, the overhead lights wavered back to life, and the growl subsided into a series of faint pulses before vanishing entirely. The next day, she told me she noticed that if she whispered a string of numbers, random soccer scores from years past, the growling would falter. She demonstrated by quietly reciting the final score of a championship match. According to her, the frequency changed pitch midway through her whisper, then ebbed away. She seemed convinced that this monstrous resonance fed on numbers, particularly those tied to real events, like old sports results. At first, I thought she was letting her imagination get the better of her, but the expression on her face was too intense to dismiss. She mentioned hearing a violently loud slam one night, right after she'd guessed a score incorrectly. She said the door pounded so hard that the metal lock twisted, leaving a faint but visible warp in the handle. I caught myself swallowing hard when I heard that. The image of a force so strong it could warp metal made my stomach swirl with dread. Curiosity wrestled with caution. I needed some form of proof, so I set up a small recorder in the guest room, leaving it running overnight. The plan was straightforward: capture the sound, analyze it in the morning, figure out if this had a rational explanation. That night, I again sensed the oppressive hush before the lights flickered off. My pulse sounded like a drumroll in my ears. The house exhaled a deep groan, and the metallic roar emerged once more. It reverberated in my bones, making my teeth ache. My breath came short and labored, as if an invisible hand gripped my lungs. I stayed awake until dawn, trying to maintain my composure, hearing the floorboards shift under my feet like fluid. When I retrieved the recorder and transferred the data onto my laptop, I realized the audio file had captured something vile. Playing it back made me nauseous. It was more than just static or mechanical whirring. The spectrum analyzer displayed bizarre shapes, lines that looked like a series of jagged teeth opening and closing, as though the sound itself was a creature consuming fragments of data. Repeated frames of the spectrogram resembled a gaping mouth, expanding wider with each passing second, almost as if it was feasting on the very frequencies it produced. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I found myself drenched in sweat. A headache pounded against the back of my skull, and I felt an overwhelming sense of panic creep up. Questions spun through my mind faster than I could process them. How could a noise look so organic in waveforms? Why did it seem to grow night after night, especially if we guessed a score incorrectly? The possibility that it was responding to our attempts at controlling it made my veins run cold. I decided to gather more data, though every fiber of my being wanted to burn that recorder and pretend nothing had happened. Over the following nights, I tried to recite various soccer scores from random years. My sister and I took turns, whispering the results of games we only vaguely remembered. The sound would quiver, sometimes diminishing to a low rumble, sometimes rising into a churning roar that felt like it could tear the walls apart. Every time we got it right, it gave us a moment of fragile peace. Merely a few seconds to breathe without feeling that hum threatening to burst our eardrums. But if we got it wrong, a violent crash would shake the room, and we'd hear the guest room door slam so hard that the frame groaned under the impact. Each failed attempt sent a fresh wave of sheer terror through my body. My limbs would tremble, and my eyes watered under the pressure of trying to hold myself together. Standing in that house felt like being trapped inside a living organism that registered every heartbeat, every anxious thought. Nights bled into each other in an exhausting loop of fear, guesswork, and the clamor of wood and metal twisting under forces we couldn't comprehend. Paranoia crept in quickly. I started to suspect every corner of the house, expecting the shadows themselves to shift when I wasn't looking. My appetite vanished. Each time I tried to eat, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten, my throat too constricted to swallow. I would go for hours without speaking, not wanting to attract the attention of whatever lingered in those walls. My sister tried to keep her composure, but I saw the dark circles under her eyes deepening, noticed the way her fingers trembled when she tried to brush her hair. She hardly ate as well, and when we sat down together in the living room, there was a near palpable sense of dread pooling between us. I reached a breaking point a week later. The nights had been relentless, the abnormal roar growing into something more than just an echo of old machinery. The spectrogram from my recorder showed a shape like a mouth, an orifice that opened wider with each passing night, swallowing a new row of frequency bars every time I analyzed it. On that particular night, after we had given what we thought was a correct score for a match from a decade ago, the roar spiked instead of diminishing. A jarring metallic crash thundered through the house, and I heard the door to the guest room slam. The noise was so loud that I felt the vibrations in my jaw. Then the lights flickered uncontrollably. In the sporadic bursts of illumination, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of something impossibly tall in the corner of the room. It vanished the moment darkness returned. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run. My breathing was fast and shallow, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my ribcage. My sister behind that door whispered words I couldn't make out. I felt a creeping disorientation, as if reality itself was warping around me. The knowledge that this entity, or whatever it was, reacted to the scoreboard guesses filled me with a frantic need to get them correct. But the scoreboard strategy was no longer reliable. Perhaps the thing had grown too strong, or perhaps it demanded something else now. My mouth was dry, my tongue felt like sandpaper, and my fingertips tingled from a lack of proper airflow. Panic had my senses in a chokehold. I resolved to confront it directly, or at least document enough evidence so I could make sense of what was happening. I retrieved the digital recorder, turned it on, and placed it in the middle of the guest room, right near the air conditioner's vent. The air in that room smelled stale, tinged with metal. My sister stood at the threshold, arms wrapped around herself, teeth chattering faintly. I suggested we both recite a series of scores from the most famous matches we could remember, certain we had them memorized. The plan was to produce a consistent, accurate stream of information. We started reciting. The air conditioner's hum provided an odd backdrop, more subdued than the monstrous resonance that lurked. The first few lines went smoothly, and I could hear the low metallic undercurrent fluctuate in response. It was as if we were singing a lullaby to an unseen beast. For a brief moment, I dared to hope this might work, that we could pacify it, maybe even force it to retreat from our home. Then one detail slipped through our grasp. A minor soccer match, something from my college days, a final score we disagreed on. My sister believed it ended 2-1. I was certain it was 3-2. We hesitated for too long, not sure which one to voice. The tension fractured the fragile calm. The lights blinked off again, and that deep mechanical growl surged through the house with renewed vigor. It was so loud, I lost my sense of balance, stumbling backward against a wall. My head throbbed with each pulse of that unholy noise. The floor felt as though it might cave in beneath me. Then came the slam. The guest room door crashed shut of its own accord, its handle twisting so hard I expected it to snap off entirely. My sister and I were separated in darkness. My stomach lurched, dread stabbing through me like a physical force. I tried to push the door open, but the handle was now contorted, jammed. The sense of something massive on the other side of the wood made me recoil. The entire door felt hot to the touch, as if some engine revved behind it. I stepped back, fear flooding my every muscle, and found myself in the hallway with only the flicker of my phone's flashlight. The metallic roar intensified, swirling around me like a tornado of razor-sharp frequencies. I braced myself against the wall, tears forming in my eyes, both from terror and the piercing pain in my ears. It felt like my head was being squeezed in a vice. At any second, I expected the old wooden floor to split open like a cracked shell, swallowing me into some new dimension. And then, as if responding to an invisible command, everything stopped. The silence hit me just as hard as the roar. I heard my sister shout from the other side of the door, saying she was all right but too afraid to move. I told her to stay put. My voice sounded so hollow in that quiet, as if the house was devouring the sound as soon as it left my mouth. With trembling hands, I inspected the door. The lock was bent in a near spiral. I had to pry at it with a crowbar from the toolbox in the storage closet to free my sister. She emerged, eyes wide and shimmering with fear. We made an immediate decision. We could no longer remain in that house overnight. My heart was still pounding, but relief mingled with fresh apprehension as we packed a few essentials and prepared to leave. The walls didn't protest. No monstrous growl reverberated. It was as if the entity relished our desperation, letting us think we could escape. My sister shut the guest room door behind her, and I checked the thermostat on the air conditioner. The numbers on the display were flickering, as though cycling through random frequencies instead of the temperature. A final chilling reminder that we weren't dealing with anything normal. I kept the recorder in my bag. The entire drive to a nearby motel, I felt a heaviness in my chest, a sense that the thing in our home could reach through the car speakers at any moment. The roads were dark, streetlights few and far between, and each shadow felt like it might contain a lurking presence. I found it hard to breathe properly, my lungs constricting with each memory of the roar. At the motel, the claustrophobic room smelled of stale cigarette smoke. I didn't mind the odor. Anything was better than the metallic tang in the guest room. My sister and I took turns showering, neither speaking much, though occasionally she mentioned feeling like we were being watched through the paper-thin walls. We tried to settle into uneasy sleep. My mind replayed the spectrogram's image, the mouth devouring row after row of frequencies. I couldn't shake the impression that it was more than a visual artifact, that it was a glimpse into something ravenous and non-human. The next morning I awoke in a cold sweat, a dull ache behind my eyes. My sister told me she had dreamt of metallic jaws clamping shut on strings of numbers. She confessed she didn't think it was just a dream. It felt like a warning or a call. She said she believed the entity grew whenever we tried to harness its rules. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was a profound terror at the thought of returning to that house. We spent the day driving past sports bars and libraries, gathering old magazines and newspapers. Our plan, though insane, was to be prepared with the right data if we had to confront that presence again. Late in the evening, we finally mustered the nerve to go back home, determined to face whatever lived in those walls. The house was quiet when we arrived. The air was stale and motionless. My heart thudded so loud I felt it in my throat. I called out for any sign of the monstrous roar, but heard only the creak of old beams settling under the night's chill. A glance at the guest room door showed the twisted handle, a silent testament to what had happened. I lingered in the hallway, my sister behind me, both of us breathing in shallow rasps. I didn't hear the growl, but the silence felt even more menacing. It pressed against my eardrums like a promise unfulfilled, waiting for the next mistake. We stepped inside carefully, adrenaline coursing through our veins, ready to recite a perfect scoreboard if necessary. But nothing answered. No thunderous slam, no spectral mouth devouring the numbers we had prepared. Only silence, heavy as lead, crushing us with the certainty that this was not a victory, merely a pause in a larger game we had yet to comprehend. As I stood there, the lights flickered one last time, and I sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle vibration that hinted the entity still lingered, just out of reach. It was waiting, quiet now, but poised to surge back the moment we let our guard down. The door to that room remained ajar, the darkness beyond its threshold thick as ink. I felt an involuntary shiver race down my spine. I realized then that no matter how many scores we memorized, no matter how precise we tried to be, this was something that defied reason. The terror was not gone. It had simply receded like a wave preparing for the next crash. My sister and I have left the room vacant, door shut, the air conditioner turned off for good. At times in the middle of the night, I still awaken to a faint rumble that makes my heart pound. I suspect the entity is stirring again, hungry for mistakes, for the incorrect scoreboard that might allow it to twist locks and slam doors until it finally claims full dominion over the house. I don't know if we can ever truly be free of it. But for now, we exist in an uneasy truce, haunted by the knowledge that a silent monster waits in the walls, feeding on frequencies and old soccer results. And every time I walk by that door, my mouth goes dry and my skin prickles, because I can feel it watching, listening, anticipating the next moment I dare to guess a score and get even a single digit wrong. Story 5. I still remember how the silence felt like a tangible weight on my chest that night. Standing in the middle of my grandfather's old farm, I could barely see beyond the faint contours of the fence line. The darkness there was more than simple absence of light. It felt charged, saturated with potential, like the negative space in a photograph waiting to be developed. My heart pounded in my ears, and my breath came in shallow gusts as I set up my camera on a wooden post. I wanted to prove to my friends that this place had no outside illumination whatsoever, that it was the perfect spot for stargazing. Little did I know I would leave with far more unsettling evidence than a picture of the Milky Way. My plan that evening was straightforward. I'd snap a few photos of the sky, then take a couple of shots of the surroundings to demonstrate just how pitch black everything was. There was a sense of isolation so complete it made the hairs on my arms prickle. The occasional rustle of leaves or scuttle of some small creature became amplified in the stillness, sounding like claws on concrete. My palms were already damp from the slight unease that always arises when one feels wholly alone in a big, dark place. That night, though, my unease grew heavier, as if it had flesh and bones, pressing against me. After capturing a few shots of the star-freckled sky, I aimed the camera around, intending to illuminate the old barn and the fence with a short burst of flash. When the flash popped, I felt a strange tingling at the base of my neck. I looked at the photo display, and in the immediate glare I thought I saw faint shapes. My logical mind insisted it was an effect of the flash reflecting on dust motes or maybe lens flare. Still, something about the shapes set my teeth on edge, so I decided I would check again once I transferred the images to my computer at home. The next morning, I carefully loaded the shots onto my laptop. At first, the photos showed exactly what I expected: a bare farmyard, looming darkness, and the silhouettes of old tools. But then I reached the final frame. My stomach dropped as I zoomed in. Standing behind me, translucent yet unmistakably there, were couples in what looked like formal evening attire. Their clothes had an old-fashioned elegance, like something from early 20th century galas, complete with bow ties and long gowns. Each figure held a small brandy glass, and in every glass the liquid swirled counterclockwise. They were arranged in neat little pairs, almost as if they were posing for a portrait. Some gazed directly into the camera, which sent a chill radiating through my chest. I had no idea what to make of it. Adrenaline surged in my veins, making my breath quicken. I rewound to confirm I hadn't accidentally superimposed an old image. Nothing in my photo library even remotely resembled that scene. It was as if those couples had been invisible to the naked eye, but somehow captured by the flash. The very thought made my heart thud heavier and my mouth go dry. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was a glitch or an elaborate prank. But I had been alone. At least I had certainly felt alone. I showed a friend the photo a few hours later, using an indirect approach, downplaying my own alarm. He simply told me the image looked spooky, but he was convinced it had to be some digital manipulation. His shrugging dismissal didn't comfort me. It only underscored how bizarre the situation was. That night, I found myself unable to sleep properly. My mind kept replaying that image, zeroing in on those brandy glasses and the swirling liquid. Why counterclockwise? Why so synchronized? Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned the couples stepping closer, their eyes pinned on me. My chest felt tight from shallow breathing, and I woke several times in a cold sweat, all nerves on edge. 3 nights passed. During that time, I tried to push the incident out of my mind, telling myself it was a trick of the light or a photo artifact. On the third night, I woke abruptly in the darkness of my bedroom. My throat burned, and I noticed a pungent scent in the air. It smelled like brandy, the type that scorches your nostrils and leaves a sweet, cloying aftertaste. I tried to move, only to realize my arms were trembling, my skin clammy. My heart pounded erratically. Swallowing was difficult because my mouth felt coated in dryness, then a strange warm bitterness. When I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my fingers brushed against shards on my desk. The lamp revealed shards of glass shaped in a perfect pentagram on the wooden surface. Each fragment shimmered, reflecting a distorted version of my face, but it wasn't my familiar face. It was me, years older, decades older. My hair was streaked with gray, my skin drawn, sagging around the eyes. I recoiled, nearly falling off the bed, a jolt of electric fear coursing through me. I tried to rationalize that the fragments must be creating some optical trick, but the reflection was so clear. The old face seemed to stare back, its eyes conveying a silent question. "Do you believe us now?" I had no memory of how those glasses got into my room or how they ended up smashed on my desk. The metallic tang of fear made my tongue feel thick in my mouth. My arms were covered in goosebumps that seemed to clamp around my entire body. I noticed droplets of an amber liquid among the shards. Putting my face closer, I confirmed it was brandy, and my breath reeked of the same pungent aroma. It was impossible to ignore the connection to those ghostly couples and the swirling glasses I had seen in the photo. They had somehow crossed from the camera's lens into my personal space. For the next 2 days, my life became a nightmare of hypervigilance. I would hear the faint clink of glass against glass just beyond my peripheral hearing. Light bulbs in my home flickered, leaving me in half darkness. Every time the lights dimmed, I felt certain someone was standing behind me. My pulse raced so much I worried I would faint from the stress. Eating was difficult because my stomach stayed in knots. At times when I happened to glance at mirrored surfaces, I swore I saw silhouettes dancing in the background, swirling brandy in that same mesmerizing counterclockwise motion. Desperate to prove to myself that this was either a hoax or a psychological breakdown, I decided to revisit the farm. Perhaps repeating the scenario might yield a different outcome and break the illusion. Rationalizing that all of it could be in my head gave me a shred of courage to try something drastic. So I drove out there as dusk settled in. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and my breathing was shallow, punctuated by sighs that felt forced and shaky. Standing again among those fields, I found the night gloom oppressive. Clouds had blotted out the moon, making the place even darker than before. My flashlight barely cut through the void. I caught myself trembling as I set my phone's camera to record, thinking I would replicate the original process. When I raised the phone, I felt a static charge race through the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. My breath quickened, and I forced myself to press the record button, then triggered the flash. Instead of the camera capturing a still shot, it switched on video mode by itself. I hadn't touched any setting to do that. My hands started to shake so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The screen displayed something swirling in the darkness, shapes, silhouettes. My chest grew tight, my heart hammering as I realized the lens was capturing the same couples, now moving around me in a slow, fluid dance. Their gowns and tuxedos glistened as if reflecting a candle-lit ballroom. They moved in a graceful circle, brandy glasses in hand, swirling that amber fluid with an eerie synchronicity. Each face held an expression of calm delight, yet their eyes glowed faintly white, as though capturing and reflecting the phone's light. And then, the video feed on the screen spun wildly, disorienting me. It was like the phone itself decided to look upward toward the sky. But in the screen, the sky wasn't a sky at all. It looked like a grand ceiling with a chandelier turning in slow circles. The couples continued dancing, their footsteps inaudible. My own breathing, ragged and loud, was the only real-world sound I could detect. My head swam, my balance failing as if I were on a rotating floor. I felt bile rise in my throat and forced it back down, cold sweat streaming down my temples. I managed to shut off the phone, plunging the farm back into silent darkness. My heart throbbed in my ears, and I stood there panting, convinced that if I didn't move, I might be trapped in that swirling gloom forever. My knees felt weak, threatening to buckle, so I stumbled back to my car. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there for what felt like hours, trembling. Even with the doors locked, I sensed them near. The slightest movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. Shadows stretched across the dashboard, contorting into ominous shapes. I eventually mustered the courage to turn on the engine. My hands were slick with sweat, making the steering wheel slippery. Driving home was a blur, and I nearly veered off the road twice because my vision kept playing tricks. The rearview mirror reflected not the usual night traffic or the empty back road, but fleeting glimpses of those couples dancing behind me, brandy glasses held high. My entire body was in panic mode, heart pounding, chest tight, breath short, mouth tasting of metal. I felt certain I was teetering on the edge of some catastrophic breakdown. Once home, I locked every window and door. Still, the sense of foreboding wouldn't fade. My living room felt cold, despite the heater humming. I pushed furniture against doors, but it did nothing to calm the dread. Every minute I expected to see those figures drifting out of the walls, swirling their brandy as if I had interrupted their private waltz. Instead of sleeping, I spent the night fixated on the phone video. My hands trembled as I replayed the footage. It was even worse on a larger screen. The couples in the video circled a focal point off-screen, occasionally lifting their glasses as if in a toast to me, or the camera. The swirling brandy always caught the phone's light, shining with a hypnotic glimmer. And at certain frames I spotted my own reflection in the swirling liquor, my face drawn and sallow, barely recognizable. Each time I paused the video, my heart kicked against my ribs like it wanted to break free. I started asking myself if I was going insane, or if some malevolent force was toying with me. Maybe the farm had a history, rituals, gatherings, something that left an imprint on the land. I remembered faint rumors I'd once heard about an old mansion that used to stand on that property decades ago, famous for hosting grand dances and lavish parties. But the details were murky at best. Nothing explained why they were choosing to appear now, or why they targeted me. Unable to rest, I paced the house, occasionally pressing my ear to the walls. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel my pulse in my wrists. The silence felt alive, pregnant with the possibility of those specters stepping into my reality at any moment. The more I thought about the brandy swirling counterclockwise, the more it seemed like some strange ritual, a cyclical draining of energy. My mind raced with wild theories. Were they stealing time from me, as hinted by the reflections that showed me aged? Were they feeding on my fear? In a sudden surge of defiance, I packed a small bag. I felt compelled to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that farm as possible. The moment I stepped outside, however, a gust of icy wind cut through me. The wind seemed to carry faint laughter, just on the edge of hearing. My teeth chattered, and my whole body shivered, not entirely from the cold but from pure apprehension. I glanced up at the stars, searching for some comforting sense of normalcy. The sky, at least, remained indifferent, flickering with cold, distant light. But I couldn't ignore what I felt, as if invisible eyes were tracking me from the corners of the yard, from behind trees, from the darkest pockets of night. My car's headlights sliced through the darkness as I pulled away, but no matter how many miles I put between me and that property, I couldn't shake the sensation that those couples were right behind. Brandy glasses in hand, their presence defying physical distance. I drove for hours until the first pale hints of dawn touched the sky. Checking into a small roadside motel, I barricaded myself inside the room. My body sagged with fatigue, and my nerves felt raw. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaning products was a relief. Mundane, familiar, reassuringly normal. Yet in the mirror above the sink, I still caught flickers of movement that didn't belong to me. By then, my paranoia was a living thing, coiled around my chest, and I almost expected the mirror to show me as an old man with centuries in his eyes. At some point, I collapsed onto the squeaky mattress, Sleep came in ragged fits, haunted by half-dreams of swirling brandy and gliding figures. When I finally woke, heart hammering in my ribcage, daylight filled the room. For a moment I felt a surge of relief. Perhaps it had all been a nightmare, but reality intruded the second I noticed my phone blinking with a new video notification. Sure enough, it showed the same ghostly couples dancing in the motel room, spinning in a graceful, silent waltz around the bed, while the ceiling loomed like a glittering ballroom. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt fresh beads of sweat trickle down my back. They were there, even this far from the farm. Now I sit with the phone in my hand, refusing to watch that new footage again. The brandy smell occasionally wafts through the air, as if carried on some unseen current. My arms tremble as I type these final lines. I know I am connected to them somehow, that my attempt to document the darkness cracked open a gateway. Whether this is a hallucination or a genuine haunting hardly matters anymore. Every time I glimpse my reflection, I see the creeping imprint of time draining from me, seeping out with each swirl of that amber liquid. I've decided I can't live in terror of every shadow. Tonight I plan to face them, if only to claim some shred of control. If I survive their visit, I will try to exorcise them with the only weapon I have, my own disbelief. Yet deep in my gut, fear flutters wildly, suggesting disbelief may not be enough. A quiet dread tells me these couples will forever be there, lurking in the edges of my vision, swirling their brandy in that cursed counterclockwise dance. Even if I physically escape, I will carry them with me in every reflection, every silent corner of a dark room. They have made their presence known, and once you glimpse them, there's no returning to an ignorance that spares you from their silent waltz. I don't know what final form this confrontation will take, or if simply refusing to watch the videos might sever their hold. All I sense is that I'm caught in a slow, methodical spiral. But if there's anything left of my old self, anything not twisted into aging reflections and brandy-scented fear, it's the will to keep going. So I grip my phone, my heartbeat like thunder in my ears, and I wait. The darkness falls again outside. My senses are sharpened, every nerve on high alert, bracing for that familiar swirl of brandy and the soft rustle of ghostly attire. This time maybe I'll be ready to meet their eyes and not look away. Or maybe I'll join their endless dance, locked in a moment that defies all logic. Either way, I refuse to let my own mind betray me further. Yet as the wind whispers beyond the door, I feel the haunting certainty. They are waiting for me, eager for another night's waltz, brandy glasses in hand, swirling in that slow, relentless counterclockwise turn. And no matter how far I run, they will find me again. The story 6. I felt the dread from the very first time I heard that scraping sound on the hardwood floor. It was faint at first, like distant fingernails tapping against rotting timber, but it cut through the quiet of my study with surgical precision. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then returned to a dull hum, just enough illumination to cast trembling shadows along the walls. My heart thumped in sync with every step I took. By the time I reached the center of the room, I realized that despite all my logic, all my market experience, there was something very wrong happening here. A darkness was creeping around the corners of my mind, whispering that I should never have messed with that board. But it was too late. I was already in too deep. I had bought the wooden board on a whim, attracted by its sturdy oak surface and the promise from an eccentric antique dealer that it could predict futures. It looked like an oversized, archaic Ouija board, but with strange etchings around the edges, symbols I didn't recognize. I had been searching for an edge in my stock market trades for months, frustrated by stagnant gains and a series of bad calls. The weight of my credit balances pressed on my mind nightly. I was desperate for a breakthrough. Initially, I treated the board as a curious novelty. I placed it on my desk, traced my fingers over its swirling patterns, and joked to myself that maybe it would guide me to the next golden trade. What happened next should have sent me running in the opposite direction. I remember an ordinary evening, the overhead lamp buzzing slightly as I prepared for the next morning's session. I set the board down, placed my fingertips lightly on a small wooden pointer, and asked the empty room which stock would pop. Suddenly, with no breeze, no open windows, that pointer jerked beneath my hands. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest and a chill, pure ice water in my veins, swept across me. It was as though the board had a life of its own. In a slow, deliberate sequence, it spelled out a ticker symbol I had never bothered to consider. I pulled my hands away in shock. The pointer kept moving, slowly completing the ticker before it went still, as if waiting. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe my muscle twitches were unconsciously causing the motion, or maybe the old house was tilting. But deep down, I sensed an otherworldly presence. Against my better judgment, I followed the board's suggestion. I entered the trade just minutes after the market opened. The results were shocking. The stock soared nearly 15% in a single session. For a moment, excitement drowned out my unease. I convinced myself it was dumb luck, but part of me knew better. Over the next days, I consulted the board repeatedly. Every night it spelled out a ticker that exploded in value the following session. My portfolio swelled. The adrenaline of rapid gains was intoxicating, overshadowing all cautionary thoughts. I tried to ignore the strange occurrences that accompanied each profitable trade. The first sign was the jazz music. Every time I closed out a position at a profit, my old stereo system turned itself on. It blared harsh, distorted notes, like a vinyl record spinning at the wrong speed, high-pitched trumpets screeching in nauseating dissonance. The first time it happened, my lungs seized with panic. The volume was so loud I felt the vibrations rattling through my ribcage. I yanked the cord from the wall, but the instruments continued somewhere within the structure of the house, as if hidden loudspeakers had been buried behind the plaster. My ears rang for hours afterward, and my heart rate refused to settle. When the music finally subsided, I was left trembling, sweat soaking my shirt, unsure if I was losing my mind. In the following weeks, my nights became battles against that incessant jazz. The longer I avoided the board, the louder the trumpets and saxophones groaned, always at times I least expected, 2 in the morning, midday, whenever I sat on my couch trying to collect my thoughts. Yet the lure of easy profit was impossible to ignore. Whenever I yielded and placed a trade the board recommended, my stereo would emit just a single, abrupt screech, then silence. It was as though the entire house exhaled with relief. Of course, it never felt like my relief. It was the board's. Eventually, I realized the board wasn't simply a predictive tool. It wanted something in return. My participation, my devotion. It demanded that I feed it trades, keep fueling that eternal bull market it so ominously spelled out one night. The pointers would shift at unexpected moments. Once it nearly pinned my hand to the table, sticky with a dark, resin-like substance seeping from the grain. The smell was acrid, reminiscent of burnt wood and something organic. My stomach churned and I fought the urge to retch. Every time I hesitated to follow its instructions, the board's surface became slick with that ghastly black sap that seemed to cling to my fingers. I would twist and pull my hands free, panting with horror, as I felt the wood throbbing beneath my skin. My sense of reality wavered each time. I began to have nightmares. In those dreams, the walls of my office peeled away, replaced by towering stock tickers flickering in midair like tortured neon ghosts. The floor melted into swirling charts that pulsed in sync with a slow, menacing heartbeat. My own, amplified and thick with fear. And there, at the center of it all, stood the board, enormous and pulsating, the pointer scuttling across its surface like an insect. Strange voices drifted in the background, a chorus chanting that I should never cash out, that I should embrace the surge. Upon waking, my sheets would be soaked in sweat, my heart pounding erratically, mouth so dry I could barely swallow. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, I gathered the courage to stop. I thought, enough is enough. The profits were substantial by that point, more than I had ever imagined. I wanted out. I wanted to break the cycle. So I ignored the board's final demand. It had spelled out a ticker I'd never heard of, something that didn't appear in any market data. Fear welled in my chest because it wasn't just a random choice. It felt like a trap. Determined to free myself, I turned off every piece of electronics in the house. triple-checked that all the power cords were unplugged. Then I crawled into bed and forced myself to forget the predictions, telling myself that I was done. That night, the music began around 3 a.m., so loud it almost blew my eardrums. My walls shuddered. Distorted trumpets and screeching horns marched around the perimeter of my consciousness. I leaped out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The stereo was unplugged, as I'd left it, but the sound still roared. It felt like the horns were inside my walls, blaring directly into my skull. My heart thudded with a frantic pace that made my chest ache. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the wailing jazz cut through, unstoppable. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, sweat rolling in cold rivulets down my back. I stumbled through my hallway, dizzy, until I reached the office door. There was a sickly sweet odor of wood polish mixed with that organic stench. I flicked on the light, and instantly my stomach twisted. The board was covered in that dark sap. Small droplets splattered across the floor. The pointer was upright, balanced impossibly on a single tip, quivering as though breathing. My eyes blurred from the rancid smell, and I kept blinking away tears. I couldn't bring myself to touch the thing. In a small flash of direct defiance, I turned away from it. I told myself I would never place another trade based on its instructions, come what may. I blacked out after that. The next thing I remember is waking in my office at dawn, slumped against the corner. My hands were covered in coarse sawdust and my eyes stung. My bones ached as if I'd been pinned to the floor all night by some invisible weight. In the center of the room, I saw what remained of the board. It had reconfigured itself. Where once lay a flat panel with cryptic letters, there now stood a small carved figure of a bull, no more than a foot high, but impossibly detailed. Its eyes glinted with dark intensity, polished in that same sap-like resin. The horns curved forward with menacing elegance, and when I drew closer, I realized the bull was breathing, its wooden flanks expanding and contracting with a slow, determined rhythm. A vibration traveled through the floor as it let out a low, mournful bellow. The sound was deep, almost felt in the bones, a sub-bass that rattled everything in my office. My heart hammered in response. Every instinct told me I was in grave danger. I felt eyes on me, an overwhelming sensation that the bull was aware of my presence, judging me. Its body glistened under the thin morning light, the edges of its wooden musculature nearly vibrating. For a moment I questioned my sanity. Was I really seeing this figure move, or had exhaustion finally unhinged me? The day passed in a blur of terror-laden confusion. I could barely bring myself to leave the office, but the claustrophobia in that space was unbearable. I sought refuge in my living room, which felt only marginally safer. I kept my phone close, unsure if I should call for help or if any rational person would believe me. I even considered telling a close friend that I'd had a weird meltdown, but as I imagined the scenario, I realized I'd likely be met with pity or ridicule. Worse still, I sensed that the bull, if it truly was alive, would punish me for sharing its secret. As evening approached, the house grew ominously silent. No jazz, no flickering lights, just a tense, pregnant hush, like the moment before a massive storm breaks. My nerves were frayed. My breathing came in shallow gulps. I went to the kitchen to splash water on my face, but nearly jumped out of my skin when I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the reflection of the faucet. Turning around, I found nothing. My breath caught in my throat. The entire time I felt this compulsion gnawing at me. The bull wanted me back in the office. Part of me insisted that I run outside, drive away, and never return. But I hesitated. Despite the horror, there was a subtle pull, a promise of infinite market success, of wealth beyond my dreams, if only I'd submit. It was the same seductive whisper that had led me to trust the board in the first place. As if in a daze, I wandered back to the office. The bull stood exactly where I'd last seen it, its carved flank shifting gently under the dim glow of the desk lamp. I thought I heard it mutter about an eternal rise, although maybe that was just the blood pounding in my ears. I steeled my nerves. My body trembled, Adrenaline coiled in every muscle. The stench of that black sap was still there, faint and cloying, making my stomach churn. My heart raced so loudly that my vision pulsed in time. I forced myself toward the bull, a dull terror coursing through me. My mind spun with questions about reality. Had I become a slave to a piece of haunted oak? Or was this all a severe mental breakdown triggered by stress and greed? I recalled that night's final dream, the infinite chanting, the stock tickers swirling overhead, and the monstrous shape of the board commanding me to place trades. My sanity had been frayed by each nightmarish vision, each unstoppable jazz barrage. My hands twitched, my breath came in shuddering rasps, but some buried fragment of reason told me I could still escape, that if I found the will to reject the bull one last time, perhaps I could break its hold. The question lingered, what would it do if I defied it again? I don't recall how long I stood there in petrified silence, eyes locked on the bull. The air itself felt alive, pressing against my chest, restricting my breathing. My pulse thundered. Then the bull's eyes glowed with a sudden, piercing intensity, and I sensed a wave of raw aggression surging from it. Like being in the presence of a wild beast, muscles poised to attack. Panic flashed through me, cold and merciless. My rational mind screamed to flee, to break the hold that thing had over me. So, summoning courage from a place I didn't know I possessed, I slammed my hands down on the desk, avoiding the bull by mere inches, and roared at it in furious denial. I told it, shaking, sweat pouring down my face, that I would never again feed it with trades. My voice came out ragged, barely recognizable. The instant I finished, the lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Sparks flickered, and I glimpsed the bull's silhouette in strobe-like flashes. A tremendous bellow ripped through the silence, more powerful than any sound system could produce. My eardrums rang, and I dropped to my knees, pressing my palms to my ears. The floor vibrated with an unholy rumbling that shook my spine. But then, as quickly as it began, it ended. In the sudden hush, my hearing was reduced to a dull roar as my pulse hammered in my skull. I groped for the flashlight I keep in my desk drawer, switched it on, and directed its beam at the desk's surface. The bull was gone. Only an outline of black resin remained, dripping slowly over the edge. My entire body shook violently, a tremor of relief and lingering fear. I knelt there, chest heaving, tears of raw tension sliding down my cheeks. In the aftermath, I packed a small bag and left the house, intending never to return. I drove until I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The entire ride, I felt the resonance of that bellow echoing through my bones. Even as I write this, safe in the flickering glow of a dim motel lamp, I can still sense the bull in my peripheral vision, a memory etched too deep to forget. My mind keeps replaying that final confrontation. I shut my eyes, and I'm back in that office, hearing the insane chorus of horns blasting from within the walls. I haven't touched the market since. My phone buzzes incessantly with price alerts I set long ago, but I refuse to look. Fear saturates every muscle, reminding me that everything has a cost. I remain torn between the seductive rush of unstoppable profits and the paralyzing terror of the board's demands. Whenever I think about returning, my skin prickles, and I feel the imprint of that dark sap on my fingertips. My throat tightens, and I swear I catch the faint trace of jazz echoing in the distance, just quiet enough to suggest it could be my imagination. Deep down, I suspect the board isn't done with me. Part of me believes it's still in the house, reassembling, waiting to lure me back with impossible promises of an eternal rise. Even now, sometimes when I drift toward sleep, I swear I hear an engine of trumpets revving up, muted behind layers of walls, ready to launch into that cacophonous spectacle once more. My heart rate spikes, and I jerk awake, struggling to swallow around the knot in my throat. There's no telling if this nightmare will follow me forever. But I do know one thing. I've tasted the darkness that lurks behind our insatiable greed. It thrives on desperation and fear, feeding on our willingness to gamble away our sanity for momentary gains. I managed to walk away, frightened, battered, forever changed, but still alive and free of that board's immediate grasp. And as I sit here, listening to my own ragged breathing, I can't shake the feeling that my defiance might not have destroyed the board's power, only delayed its next move. And that possibility is more terrifying than any dream, for it suggests the horror I encountered is still out there, urging someone else, or even me, to bet it all again. Story 7. I remember the first time I heard the wet footsteps outside my beach house. It was the kind of night when the sea thunders against the shore and the air feels thick with electricity. A single flash of lightning illuminated the living room for less than a second, but that was enough to cast moving shadows where there should have been none. My heart lurched in my chest. I had never been the type to scare easily, but something about those fleeting silhouettes in the corners made me feel as though my entire body was jolted with dread. My pulse pounded in my ears and a thin film of sweat prickled across my brow, despite the chill from the storm outside. I'm not a superstitious man. At least I never considered myself one before I bought the 3 wooden dolls. They were carved by local fishermen, stoic figurines with hollow eyes and angular jaws. I thought they would be harmless decorations for the sideboard in my beach house, a rustic touch that honored the local culture. But the moment I set them down, I felt a faint unease stir in the pit of my stomach. It was as if their carved eyes were following me, tracking my every movement from the moment I unwrapped them. The fisherman from whom I purchased these carvings had told me, indirectly, that each doll was meant to represent the spirit of the sea. One for the tides, one for the storms, and one for what lies beneath the waves. They spoke in hushed voices about these figurines, mentioning ancient traditions of warding off ill fortune or paying respect to unpredictable waters. I had listened, but I never truly believed. Yet now I find myself alone, listening to the storm rage outside, my heart skittering in my chest. The sideboard is empty. The dolls are not there. Instead, I hear those damp footsteps again, a slap of wet wood against the tiled floor by the entrance. Lightning flickers through the windows, and each time, a fleeting glimpse of the entryway is illuminated. My breath catches. The 3 dolls are lined up in front of the main door, their jaws parted as though drinking in the salty, storm-tossed air. I have never seen inanimate objects move on their own, but the proof is there. My mind races in circles. Adrenaline surges, and I force myself to approach them. My palms are so clammy I can barely grip the banister as I descend the stairs. My breathing grows ragged, each exhale leaving my lips quivering. The distant thunder rolls, shaking the windows, and for a moment, I can't tell if the pounding in my head is the storm or the frantic tempo of my own heartbeat. When I finally gather the courage to check the front door, I see water pooling at the threshold. The rug there has been pushed deliberately against the gap beneath the doorframe. I stare, trying to comprehend how 3 small dolls could have blocked the water from flooding the house. The notion is absurd, yet the evidence is irrefutable. A wave of nausea builds. I want to rationalize it. Maybe I placed the rug myself and just forgot. But in my mind's eye, I can see exactly how I left the rug when I arrived. It was perfectly centered. Now it's wedged against the door, sopping wet, forming a makeshift barrier. My skin prickles with unease as I notice the wooden floor near the door marred with scratches. They form a symbol, interlacing lines like fishhooks or twisted runes. I search online frantically for any meaning in local fishermen's iconography, and eventually, I discover references to perpetual vigilance. My throat goes dry. The scratch marks are deep enough that I can feel the grooves when I run my fingers over them, as though the dolls had used jagged nails to carve them into the floorboards. That night, I barely sleep. Every crack of thunder jerks me awake. I imagine I hear something scuttling in the halls, a soft wooden clack like puppets dancing. Sweat pools at the base of my neck, and the stench of salt water lingers in the air. My body feels rigid, my jaw clenched against waves of dread I can't fully explain. At dawn, I finally drift off, only to be awakened by the sunlight streaming through the window. I expect to see the dolls still poised at the door, but when I make my way downstairs, they are back on the sideboard, their hollow eyes staring out at the sea. I try to live with it. For several days, there are no storms, and nothing unusual happens. I start to relax, telling myself it was all a hallucination triggered by exhaustion and stress. But the next time the sky darkens and clouds gather over the ocean, that gnawing feeling returns to my gut. The wind howls, and raindrops rattle against the glass like someone throwing handfuls of pebbles at the windows. I cling to the sofa, feeling each gust of wind as though it is a threat. Then comes the slow, rhythmic plodding of wooden feet. This time, I don't rush to look. I can't bring myself to face them again. Instead, I remain curled up, every muscle in my body tensed. My mind conjures images of the dolls creeping, wet and dripping, across the floorboards, jaws slack and trembling with anticipation. My breathing becomes shallow. My heart races until it throbs painfully. I realize I am drenched in sweat, yet ice-cold shivers course through my veins. At some point, I force myself to peek into the hall. In the flicker of a lightning flash, I see 3 small silhouettes lined up at the window instead of the door. Their wooden limbs are contorted, and their expressions are almost ravenous. They appear to be gazing out at the raging sea as if protecting the house from an unseen threat, or perhaps calling something from the depths. I stay still, pressed against the wall, too terrified to even blink, until the next lightning flash reveals they're gone. The day after that storm, I begin receiving strange messages from a neighbor. He claims to see 3 figures on my porch late at night, patrolling back and forth whenever the wind picks up. He mentions in a low voice that these figures look small and are dwarfed by the furniture out there. He wonders how they could be real people. According to him, the silhouettes vanish whenever he tries to take a closer look, and more than once, he has seen them illuminated by brief bursts of lightning. Lightning that, he says, never makes the official weather reports. I listen, my stomach churning with dread. He mentions the sky flickering overhead when the forecast calls only for mild drizzle. He describes the figures standing guard, as if waiting for a storm that no one else can witness. My palms sweat, and I try to steady my voice, but the fear courses through me in tremors that tighten every muscle. I wonder if I should get rid of the dolls, throw them into the ocean, or burn them. But a creeping sensation warns me that any attempt to destroy them might provoke something far worse. As time goes on, my sleep becomes fractured and restless. I begin to notice that the house itself seems different. The walls creak with a frequency that can't be explained by the wind alone. Door hinges groan like living things in agony. The ocean, once a soothing presence, now has a roar that feels personal, like it's calling out to me specifically, or perhaps to the 3 wooden watchers perched inside. My nights are spent pacing from room to room, blood pounding in my veins, expecting at any moment to turn a corner and find them staring at me again. I recall a particularly suffocating night when the storm seemed to coil around the house with an almost sentient fury. The power went out, leaving me with only the meager glow of a flashlight. Each time I swept the beam across the living room, the shadows seemed to dart just out of view. I strained my ears for any sign of the dolls, my heart clenching at the thought of hearing that ominous click-clack of wet wood. When I reached the sideboard, they were gone. No surprise there. A raw panic seized me. My breath came in ragged bursts as I heard a slow, deliberate scraping noise coming from somewhere behind the couch. My instincts screamed at me to turn away, to lock myself in the bedroom and wait out the night. But something compelled me forward. Maybe it was anger, maybe desperation. I held my flashlight tightly and crept around the furniture, every step feeling like an impossible effort, my calf muscles trembling with tension. I found them in a corner, hunched over something. Their jaws were open, and though they were just carvings of wood, the lines of their faces seemed contorted into a predatory hunger. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My throat felt parched, my tongue heavy in my mouth. The small wooden bodies were splattered with sea spray, as if they had just come from the ocean itself. I backed away slowly, not daring to breathe. The wave of nausea and dread was overpowering, and my vision swam with black spots. I wondered if I was losing my mind. Perhaps these weren't ordinary figurines at all. Perhaps they were manifestations of some ancient, watchful force that prowls during storms. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house for a while. I left for the city, intending to hire someone to cleanse the place or at least store the dolls away. During that time, I received more reports from my neighbor. He said he had witnessed tiny silhouettes pacing my porch during a thunderless storm. He insisted the shapes seemed drenched, trailing water as they moved. He also mentioned the disturbing symbol carved into my front step, the same shape I had seen scratched onto the floor, the sign of perpetual vigilance. He conveyed his concern, wondering if I should return to set things right. According to him, the storms around my property were intensifying, yet the official weather forecasts showed nothing out of the ordinary. So, with a sinking feeling in my gut, I packed up my courage and headed back to the beach house. The drive was unnervingly calm. A hazy sky hung overhead, neither promising rain nor guaranteeing sunlight. It was as though the weather itself was waiting for me to arrive. The air felt heavier the moment I stepped inside, like a physical presence pressing against my chest. The windows were all intact, but a fine layer of salt encrusted the glass from the inside, as if sea spray had somehow forced its way through sealed panes. The entire house smelled of brine and damp wood. My heart thudded, and I swallowed hard. I kept expecting to see the dolls lurking in the hallway or peering around a doorframe, but the sideboard was empty, and the rest of the rooms were disturbingly silent. My neighbor came by to check on me. He mentioned, in subdued tones, that he had seen lightning flashes at odd hours the previous night, though he hadn't heard any thunder. He had even tried filming it, but his camera caught only darkness. The tension in my shoulders wound ever tighter as he spoke. I wanted to run from the house, to abandon it, but I also felt drawn back by a force I can't quite explain, some sense that it was my responsibility to confront these entities. That night, clouds gathered across the sky, swirling in a strange pattern directly above my property. I sat in the living room with the lights on, my nerves on a knife's edge. A hush fell over everything as though the world was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered. My pulse hammered. I heard the slow, familiar drip of water near the front door. My mouth went dry and my limbs felt heavy as lead. I rose shakily to see what was happening, my body trembling with each step. The three dolls stood at the threshold, jaws parted. Rain began to lash the windows in horizontal sheets. Lightning illuminated the porch. In that sudden brightness, the dolls seemed to glow with a wet sheen, their carved faces twisted in unspoken warning. They stepped, if that's the right word for it, further into the house, leaving faint footprints behind them. I felt my stomach turn to ice. I steeled myself, refusing to recoil. With the wind howling outside, I spoke words in a low, broken mumble, uncertain if they were pleas or demands for them to stop. I felt foolish, but also desperate. The air crackled with tension. Another flash of lightning turned every object in the living room into a jagged silhouette. The dolls stopped, turning their carved heads in unison toward me. In that moment, my entire body locked up. My heart felt like it might burst from sheer terror. They tapped their wooden feet in a slow, deliberate rhythm. My mind raced. I sensed that the symbol carved into my floor, that perpetual vigilance, was not merely a warning for me. It was a binding. They were guardians, bound to this place, standing sentinel between something in the ocean and my home. But guardians can also be harbingers. My lungs constricted as I realized they might protect me one moment and entrap me the next, depending on forces beyond my understanding. The storm outside reached a crescendo, rattling the house to its foundations. Rain pounded the windows with punishing intensity. The dolls then turned toward the door, as though responding to a call. A brilliant arc of lightning seared through the sky, and for an instant, I saw the symbol from the floor glowing in the reflection on the glass. My breath caught. When I blinked again, they were gone, leaving only the dripping footprints and the lingering tang of salt in the air. I've decided I won't live in that house anymore, but I haven't sold it. Something compels me to keep it, as if my presence, or at least my occasional return, maintains some precarious balance. The fisherman's carvings remain inside, and I can't bring myself to destroy them. Deep down, I suspect they're not the true source of the terror. merely an extension of something older and more powerful than I can comprehend. Even now, I sometimes lie awake in my city apartment, far from the ocean's roar, unable to sleep when the forecast calls for storms. My heart starts racing at the memory of those damp footsteps, and I catch myself expecting to hear them in the hallway of my building. I check the weather updates obsessively, certain that I'll see a rogue thunderstorm forming on the radar above that distant stretch of coastline. Neighbors near my beach house still mention the occasional flicker of distant lightning that no meteorologist can explain, the faint rumble of thunderless storms, and small shapes seen pacing under the eaves in the flickering light. The final time I visited, I found a new set of scratches on the inside of the doorframe, lines and hooks interwoven into a design reminiscent of swirling waves. I took it as a sign to leave well enough alone. Whether they are guardians or wardens, those dolls stand in perpetual vigilance, connected to storms that don't appear in any forecast. There is no escaping that truth. Still, I feel uneasy whenever I think about my own role in this haunting. Perhaps it chose me. Perhaps I brought it on myself by taking home what should have remained in the fisherman's hands. There's a maddening sense of responsibility that gnaws at me. Sometimes, when a thunderstorm passes over the city, I wake drenched in sweat, convinced I hear the soft patter of wet feet climbing the stairs outside my apartment door. I brace myself, waiting for the inevitable knock or the faint scratch of wooden nails. But it never comes, at least not yet. I've considered going back for one final confrontation, stepping into the house during the worst storm of the season to face whatever force lurks behind those carved eyes. But every time, my nerves fail me. My pulse races just imagining the howling wind and those three small figures standing guard, jaws open, gazing hungrily at the tempest. I don't know if it's even possible to banish them. Perhaps the sea itself has chosen them as eternal sentinels. Or perhaps they simply wait for me to return, so they can show me something far more terrifying than I've already experienced. The truth is, I cannot be sure whether they protect me or threaten me. Their presence in my memories makes my skin crawl, yet I cannot deny that they once saved my house from flooding. That contradiction festers in my mind, a reminder of how fragile my sense of safety really is. Every passing storm, every distant rumble of thunder, brings back that twisting fear in my gut, the dryness in my mouth, the clench of my stomach. And so, I linger in the uncomfortable space between wanting to know and fearing the answer. My nights remain fraught with unease. My dreams are peppered with lightning flashes and the relentless tapping of wooden feet. The symbol of perpetual vigilance is now etched into my consciousness, and I'm left to wonder if I'll ever truly be free of those three carved figures, or if they stand guard over me even now, ensuring I remember that some forces cannot be tamed, only witnessed. If there is one consolation, it's that I have survived, though I'm not sure what that survival means in the grander scheme. The oppressive sense of being watched has never fully left me, and I doubt it ever will. Even in the sunlight, I'll sometimes think I see a small wooden head peeking around a corner, or a wet footprint on the stair. My heart jumps each time, my skin prickling with goosebumps. But I'm alone. There are no footsteps. No one's there. Or so I tell myself. And each time thunder echoes in the distance, I remember the story all over again. The memory of that salt-laden air, those carved jaws parted in silent vigilance, and the symbol that binds them to that house, and perhaps to me, remains like a never-healing wound. It resonates, a drumbeat of dark possibilities that keeps me awake, eyes wide, breath trembling, as I wonder whether the next storm will finally bring them back. Story 8. The shadows move differently here. I noticed it first 3 weeks ago during my night shift at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, where the ancient corridors stretch like arteries through the building's decrepit heart. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, their dying gasps creating a strange dance of light and darkness across the peeling walls. But that night, as I walked past the east corridor on my way to check on a patient, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow detached from its owner, lingering for just a moment too long before melting back into the darkness. I blinked, convinced my exhausted mind was playing tricks after 16 straight hours on duty. Yet in the weeks that followed, the strange anomalies only multiplied until I could no longer deny what I was seeing. In this hospital, some shadows have a will of their own. My name is Dr. Daniel Mercer. At 41, I've spent nearly half my life in hospitals, the last 7 years at St. Augustine. The night shift suited me. Fewer administrators, fewer questions, and the quiet allowed me to focus on my patients. I've always prided myself on being rational, methodical, a man of science. Until now, I would have scoffed at anyone who suggested the supernatural. But how else can I explain what I've been witnessing in these halls? The first incident I could rationalize away. The second made my skin prickle with unease. By the third night, when I distinctly counted 7 shadows in a room with only 5 people, I began keeping notes. My colleagues hadn't noticed anything, or if they had, they weren't admitting it. Nurse Patel raised an eyebrow when I casually mentioned the strange lighting effects in the East Wing. She reminded me I'd been working too many double shifts and suggested I take some time off. Her concern seemed genuine, but I caught her glancing nervously down the hallway as she spoke, her eyes tracking something I couldn't see. Last Thursday, while checking on Mr. Fernandez in room 307, I experienced something that shattered any remaining skepticism. The elderly man had been admitted for pneumonia, his condition stable but requiring overnight observation. As I adjusted his IV, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, his eyes wide with terror. His voice came out as a raspy whisper as he described figures standing in the corners of his room at night, watching him. They came from the shadows, he said, and they whispered about fire and pain. I assured him it was just medication-induced hallucinations, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my uncertainty. As I left his room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. When I turned around, I saw my shadow on the wall, and beside it, another silhouette that mimicked my movements for 3 steps before veering off in another direction entirely. That night, I brought my digital camera to work. If these phenomena were real, I needed evidence. Between rounds, I took dozens of photos of the corridors, patient rooms, empty ones to protect privacy, and especially areas where I'd previously noticed shadow anomalies. When I reviewed the images later in the break room, my coffee grew cold beside me as I stared at the screen in disbelief. In most photos, nothing unusual appeared, just the drab, institutional setting of an aging hospital. But in a series taken near the juncture of the East and North Wings, the discrepancies were undeniable. One image showed a clear human silhouette at the end of the hallway, though I knew with absolute certainty I had been alone when taking it. Even more disturbing were the photos where shadows visible to my naked eye simply didn't appear on camera, as if the digital sensor couldn't capture their essence. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the images. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the perpetual chill of the hospital. My throat constricted, making each breath a conscious effort. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations, light anomalies, camera malfunctions, my own sleep-deprived perception, but none could account for what I was seeing. I'm a doctor. I understand the physical symptoms of fear, but knowing the physiological causes of my racing heart and constricted pupils didn't make them any less real or terrifying. The next morning, instead of going home to sleep, I found myself in the hospital's administrative archives. The basement-level records room smelled of mildew and neglect, with yellowed papers and aging file cabinets that hadn't been digitized despite the hospital's repeated promises to modernize. The elderly clerk seemed surprised by my interest in the building's history, but directed me to the appropriate section with a warning that the organization system hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Hours passed as I dug through architectural plans, maintenance records, and administrative memos. My eyes burned from strain and lack of sleep, but adrenaline kept me alert. Finally, in a water-damaged folder labeled 1976-1979 Incidents, I found what I was looking for. Newspaper clippings and internal reports documented a fire that had swept through the hospital's East Wing on October 17, 1978. 11 patients and 4 staff members had been trapped. The official cause was listed as an electrical malfunction, though several internal memos suggested possible negligence regarding safety protocols. What sent ice through my veins wasn't the fire itself, but what came after. The damaged wing had been sealed off rather than repaired, a temporary measure that became permanent as funding dried up. More disturbing were the handwritten notes from the hospital director at the time, referencing continued disturbances and unexplained phenomena following the fire. The final memo, dated April 1979, ordered the wing permanently closed and all access points sealed, with strict instructions that the area was to be removed from all future hospital plans and documentation. It was to be forgotten, as if erasing it from maps could erase what had happened there. I left the archives with my mind reeling and my shirt sticking to my back despite the basement's chill. The East Wing, the very area where I'd first noticed the shadow anomalies. The wing that supposedly ended in a solid wall where the corridor took a sharp turn toward the north section. But according to these original floor plans, the corridor didn't end. It continued into a substantial wing that had housed long-term care patients and the burn unit. A wing that should still exist, hidden behind drywall and decades of institutional amnesia. Sleep eluded me that day. I lay in my apartment with the blinds drawn, my mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The scientific part of me demanded logical explanations, yet the evidence pointed toward something beyond conventional understanding. My temples throbbed as competing theories battled for dominance. Were the shadows some kind of energy imprint left by trauma? Hallucinations brought on by environmental factors in the old building? Mold spores, carbon monoxide, electrical fields interfering with brain function, or something more directly supernatural? The thought made my stomach clench, yet I couldn't dismiss it entirely. That night I arrived at work early, armed with the old floor plans and my camera. My colleagues noticed the difference in me immediately. Nurse Chen asked if I was feeling all right, commenting on my bloodshot eyes and pallid complexion. I mumbled something about insomnia and hurried to begin my rounds, hyper-aware of the shadows that stretched and contracted as I moved through the halls. The shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed on autopilot, while my attention remained fixed on the shadows. They seemed more active tonight, more numerous. Twice I felt something brush against me in empty corridors. The air grew increasingly heavy, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. The constant low hum of the hospital, beeping machines, distant voices, the HVAC system's labored breathing, seemed to form patterns just below the threshold of comprehension, like whispers I couldn't quite make out. At 3:17 a.m., during the quietest part of the night shift, I stood before the wall that shouldn't exist. According to the original plans, this blank expanse of painted drywall concealed the entrance to the sealed wing. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling nothing unusual, just smooth paint over solid material. Yet the temperature here was notably colder, my breath forming small clouds in the air. As I pressed my palm flat against the wall, the overhead lights flickered. My shadow stretched behind me, elongating unnaturally across the floor and up the opposite wall. And then, it moved independently of me. I froze, pulse hammering in my throat as my shadow raised an arm, while my actual arm remained at my side. A wave of dizziness washed over me, my vision tunneling as I struggled to process what I was seeing. The shadow turned its head, a movement so human and deliberate, it couldn't be mistaken for a trick of light. It was looking at me. From the corner of my eye, I noticed other shadows gathering, sliding along the walls and floor from other parts of the hospital, converging on this spot like water flowing downhill. My muscles locked in primal terror, sweat immediately drenching my scrubs despite the unnatural cold. I wanted to run, but remained rooted in place, watching as the shadows grew more distinct, taking on features, suggestions of faces, limbs, individual identities. The wall beneath my hand suddenly felt different, softer, warmer. I yanked my arm back in revulsion, but not before feeling the surface give slightly, like pressing against flesh rather than plaster and wood. A low sound emanated from within or behind the wall, a frequency so deep it was felt more than heard. vibrating in my chest cavity and inner ear. Using every ounce of willpower, I broke free from paralysis and stumbled backward, nearly falling as my legs threatened to give out. The shadows surged forward, not aggressively, but with unmistakable purpose, reaching toward the wall. Where their darkness touched the surface, the white paint seemed to ripple and dissolve, revealing glimpses of something behind. Flashes of another corridor, charred walls, medical equipment from decades past. My rational mind shattered. With a hoarse cry that I barely recognized as my own, I fled, running blindly through the corridors with no thought except escape. But the hospital had transformed around me. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors appeared where none had been before, and every shadow reached for me as I passed. The building had become a labyrinth, and at its heart lay that sealed wing, pulsing like a malevolent second heart within the hospital's architecture. I don't remember how I found my way to the emergency exit. My next clear memory is sitting in my car in the parking lot, hands shaking so violently I couldn't insert the key into the ignition. My phone showed dozens of photos I had no recollection of taking, blurred images of corridors, shadows with two distinct human features, and in the final shots, what appeared to be a partially open doorway where the solid wall had been, revealing a glimpse of fire-blackened corridor beyond. 3 days have passed since that night. I've called in sick, citing a severe flu. The hospital administrator sounded relieved rather than concerned, mentioning that my behavior had been causing concern among staff. In my apartment, with the blinds drawn and lights on, I've been reviewing hospital records, cross-referencing names of those who died in the fire with patient complaints about shadow figures in the years since. The pattern is undeniable. Tomorrow I return to work. Not because I've conquered my fear. The terror remains a constant companion, turning my mouth dry and sending tremors through my hands whenever I consider what awaits me. I return because I understand now what the shadows want. They're not malevolent, they're trapped. The sealed wing exists in some in-between state, neither fully present in our world, nor entirely gone, and those who died there remain caught in the same limbo. The shadows are their attempts to reach out, to be acknowledged, to have their suffering recognized. The hospital administration knows. They've always known. The sealing of that wing wasn't just a budget decision, it was a containment measure. But ignorance and denial have only allowed the phenomena to grow stronger over the decades. I've found documents suggesting periodic incidents throughout the hospital's history. Always downplayed, always covered up. I don't know if I'm heading toward resolution or my own undoing. My medical training offers no framework for what I'm experiencing. All I know is that those shadows need a witness, and for whatever reason, they've chosen me. As I write these words, I can see my own shadow on the wall beside my desk, and though I sit perfectly still, it slowly raises its hand in acknowledgement. I find myself raising my hand in return, a silent pact between me and whatever awaits at St. Augustine Memorial. The shadows have stories to tell. Tomorrow night, I'm going to listen. Story 9. The first night it happened, I was jolted awake by an inexplicable sense of dread. There was a stifling stillness in my apartment, as though the air had grown dense enough to choke me. The clock on my nightstand pulsed with a dull red light, and I saw that it was exactly 4:12 a.m. My mouth felt like sandpaper, my shirt stuck to my clammy skin, and my heart hammered against my ribs so violently that I worried my chest might explode. Then I heard it, the low-pitched screech of metal scraping against the hallway floor, a deliberate sound echoing in rhythmic bursts. It crept closer, inch by inch, and I realized with a wave of nausea that it was the wheelchair. I'd come into possession of the old wheelchair a few weeks earlier under bizarre circumstances. The previous occupant of a unit in the same building had left it behind, and since the property manager knew I had trouble with a knee injury, he suggested I keep the device. I accepted with reluctance, primarily because my legs still gave me trouble at times, and the building had no elevator. Despite the caretaker's explanation that the wheelchair came from a former tenant who was no longer around, the details of its origin always felt hazy. There was something about the worn leather seat and the rusty metal frame that made me shudder, as though it carried an imprint of its past occupant. But I brushed off that initial discomfort, too tired from my daily routine to worry about the intangible vibes of an inanimate object. I stored the wheelchair in the corridor outside my studio apartment because the space inside was too cramped. A narrow hallway, barely wide enough to fit two people shoulder to shoulder, led to my living room, which doubled as a workspace and dining room. The corridor light flickered, probably from old wiring, so it always cast this ghostly strobe over the battered wheelchair whenever I passed by. That night, as soon as I heard the squeaks, my ears pricked with fright. I forced myself out of bed, ignoring the cold sweat chilling my spine. Outside my bedroom door, I flicked on the overhead light, but it buzzed angrily and died. I tried not to panic. It was just a faulty bulb, I told myself, and my racing heart was just an after effect of being startled from sleep. But the hallway was too dark. The only glow came from the half-open door to my living room, where the desk lamp spilled its pale, sickly light across the floor. In that narrow band of illumination, the wheelchair rolled toward the desk, so slow and deliberate that I could hardly breathe as I watched. The wheels left a faint trail on the floor. At first, I thought it was just dust. When I stepped closer, however, I realized it was rust. Tiny specks flaking off the metal rims, forming a line like breadcrumbs marking the path. The wheelchair halted by the desk and just waited. My entire body was trembling, but my curiosity was stronger than my panic. Step by cautious step, I moved closer, each creak of the floorboards matching the quickening pace of my heartbeat. I stood behind the chair, noticing for the first time that its seat cushion was shredded in places I hadn't seen before, as if it had been clawed from within. My throat felt tight. The rational side of my brain insisted I must be dreaming, or maybe my half-awake state was playing tricks on me. Yet the scene felt too tangible. The smell of metal, the grit of rust under my bare feet, the dryness stinging my eyes. I sank onto the seat, more out of a need to steady myself than out of any real desire to sit. The moment I did, I heard a distinct hiss from the wheels, almost like a sigh of acknowledgement. Despite my pounding anxiety, I found myself in front of my desk, hands hovering over my keyboard. I often do some writing to calm my nerves, capturing fleeting thoughts or describing dreams so I can analyze them later. That night, the words just flowed out of me in a feverish stream. Each keystroke felt synchronized with the soft squeaking sound from the wheelchair's tires. It was as though the chair was guiding my rhythm, each shift of my shoulders prompting another keystroke. For about an hour, I was lost in that trance, deliriously productive, as if the words were not my own. I barely registered the sweat trickling down my temples. My breathing was shallow, controlled, yet my fingertips practically vibrated against the keyboard. Finally, an ache in my lower spine forced me to pause. I decided to stand and stretch, but the moment I tried, the backrest stiffened. I almost screamed when I realized the wheelchair wasn't letting me go. It had locked its wheels, and the backrest pressed into me with a chilling force. I twisted, braced my palms against the armrests, and strained to stand, but the seat was clinging to me. I wrestled with the chair, my jaw tight and my lungs burning. In a final jerk, the backrest snapped free, releasing me with enough force to fling me forward. I landed painfully on my knees, and I felt the sting shoot up my injured leg. My adrenaline was so high, I only registered the pain as a dull roar. I scrambled away from the wheelchair, panting, eyes locked on it as though it might come after me again. A cold draft slid over my sweaty skin, and I realized I was freezing. My shirt was damp, and my arms were covered in goosebumps. It took me a few breaths to notice rust-colored streaks across my sleeves. When I looked down, I saw more than just streaks. There were intricate impressions, like twisted metal patterns, pressed into the fabric of my coat. They resembled a brand, a faint silhouette of the chair's frame, as though it had burned its design into me. I couldn't fathom how that could happen without heat, but the marks were there, undeniable. I spent the rest of the night standing, eyes darting between the wheelchair and the trailing line of rust on the floor. Each time I mustered the courage to turn off the desk lamp, My pulse throbbed so painfully that I had to flick the light back on. Eventually, I collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to remain vigilant. My sleep was scattered, plagued by nightmarish flickers of wheels chasing me down endless corridors, the squeaking sound intensifying with each corridor I turned. When morning finally came, I forced myself to check the footage from my webcam. I'd left it running, an old habit of mine to record my late-night writing sessions. But the playback was impossible to interpret. Instead of seeing me, the video displayed a figure cloaked in a veil of rusted mesh, thin strands draping over a pale, indistinct face. That figure sat precisely where I had been, hunched over the keyboard, typing furiously. The screen flickered in time with the figure's typing, flashing lines of text that made me dizzy trying to read. My body tensed, goosebumps rippling across my skin, as I noticed that the lines on the screen formed a story about someone who disappeared, replaced by an identical counterpart who carried on that person's life seamlessly. The text was disjointed, broken sentences about a protagonist becoming trapped, only to be replaced by an identical figure, continuing his existence as though nothing had changed. The entire recording lasted for more than an hour, yet I had no recollection of even half that time passing. Over the next few days, the sense of unease in my apartment intensified. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and I often felt as though something hovered just on the edge of my vision. I'd catch glimpses of movement, but when I turned my head, nothing was there. My appetite dwindled, my sense of taste dulled. Every evening, I double-checked the hallway to make sure the wheelchair stayed put. Sometimes, as I passed it, I thought I heard tiny clicks from the wheels, like they were shifting position all on their own. When 4:12 a.m. arrived, I never had to check the clock. My body recognized the moment with eerie precision. My eyelids would spring open, my heartbeat galloping as I waited for that scraping noise. It was never long before I heard it again. Metallic squeals puncturing the silence, inching closer. Each night, the wheelchair took me to my desk, and I felt a compulsion to sit. The seat would press against the back of my thighs in a cold, commanding way, and my fingers would race across the keyboard, channeling an urgency I couldn't explain. I typed page after page, but the moment I tried to read what I'd written, it seemed to vanish from the screen. The lines would be garbled or replaced with some cryptic text that matched the style of the figure in my webcam footage. I tried confiding in a neighbor once, describing the eerie sounds and the wheelchair's odd behavior. Although I avoided direct details, I mentioned that I might be dealing with some sort of hallucination or mechanical glitch. The neighbor was polite, but clearly thought I was too tired or too stressed. He suggested I get more rest, maybe try meditation or see a specialist. I nodded, unable to muster the courage to explain everything I'd experienced, the rust trails, the camera footage, or the tight, cold embrace of the chair's backrest. Desperate to break the pattern, I resolved to move the wheelchair out of my apartment entirely. One afternoon, I pushed it down the hall, ignoring the pangs in my knee as I forced it into the building's storage locker in the basement. The place was cramped and smelled of mildew, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead casting ghoulish shadows against stacks of old furniture and boxes. I locked the door behind me, feeling some measure of relief. Yet, deep inside, a queasy dread coiled in my gut. I sensed I'd merely offended whatever presence clung to that device. When I returned to my apartment, the hallway felt emptier, but not safer. That night, I set up my webcam again. The phone in my pocket showed 4:10 a.m. when I glanced at it one last time before dozing off on the couch. In my sleep, I felt pinned down, as though weighed by a giant block of ice. I snapped awake to a thunderous squeal echoing through the corridor. Heart racing, I flicked on a lamp to see the living room door standing ajar. My skin tingled with raw fear. I rose cautiously, and there it was. The wheelchair stood at my desk like a loyal pet awaiting its master. My lips felt numb as my breath rasped in my throat. I stepped toward it, running my hand along the seat. The cushion was still battered, but I noticed it was damp and shockingly cold, like it had been sitting in a freezing vault. I turned my gaze to the floor, noticing streaks of rust from the front door all the way to my desk. That meant it had traveled through the locked door of the storage locker and up 2 flights of stairs without anyone hearing. My body was racked with chills, and I could feel the blood pounding in my head. Against all better judgment, I sat down again, trembling from head to toe. My rational mind screamed at me to run, to leave the building, but an overpowering curiosity or compulsion drew me in. The wheels hissed softly, their squeaking pulses aligning once more with my typing. I hammered at the keys, sweat pooling beneath my arms, my ears ringing. It felt like something was controlling me, some presence funneling words through my fingertips. Each new line gave me an unexplainable sense of dread, as though I was writing my own disappearance. Tears burned in my eyes, and my throat constricted until I could barely swallow. I wanted to break free, but the chair's backrest pressed me forward. A surge of adrenaline allowed me to twist my upper body to one side, and in doing so, the backrest popped open just enough for me to wrench myself free. I fell onto the desk, panting, my limbs shaking. My skin felt sticky with clammy perspiration, and my vision swam. When I looked down at my coat sleeve, I saw new rust prints. The outline of the wheelchair's spokes etched into the fabric with such exact detail that it seemed like a mechanical tattoo. My lungs burned from panting, the taste of copper filling my mouth. I scrambled for my phone to check the footage. The camera had recorded a figure again, like a silhouette draped in a filmy, corroded veil. As it typed, the footage zoomed in on a digital manuscript describing a protagonist who would become trapped in a haunted device, replaced by another self that could walk away freely. No matter how many times I replayed the clip, the details made my stomach turn. I shut off the camera in horror. By dawn, I made a resolution. I had to rid myself of this cursed piece of equipment, no matter the risk. The only plan I could conceive was to push it out of the building and abandon it far away. But an unshakable feeling told me that if I tried, it would find its way back. Panic, thick as tar, climbed up my throat. My reflection in the living room mirror looked haggard, with dark circles hollowing my eyes, my skin ashen and clammy. It was as though I was seeing not quite myself, but a version undone by fear. Just as my mind teetered on the brink, I felt a sudden calm wash over me. Maybe it was the body's way of coping with an unthinkable situation. I pulled on a fresh coat, careful not to touch the rusted stains on the old one, grabbed the wheelchair by its handles, and pushed it out the front door with all my strength. I dragged it down the hallway, ignoring the rattling squeaks that resonated against the walls, then down the stairs, step by agonizing step. My knee throbbed fiercely, but the adrenaline rendered pain secondary. I kept thinking I heard whispers, or maybe just the rasp of metal, urging me to reconsider. My pulse hammered in my eardrums, and each new wave of sweat soaked through my collar. Yet I pushed until I reached the back exit that led onto a narrow side street. There, in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, I shoved the wheelchair onto the pavement. For a moment, it sat in the half-darkness, the faint glint of rust making it look like it was coated in dried blood. I felt like it was watching me. The wind whistled through the deserted street, and every hair on my arms stood on end. My throat constricted, and I wavered, uncertain if I could leave it behind. But somewhere deep within me, I found the resolve to turn away. I limped back inside, latched the door shut, and retreated to my apartment. I spent the remaining hours before sunrise pacing the living room, my breath hitching at the slightest creak. When morning came, I opened the blinds to let in a feeble wash of sunlight. My body was exhausted, my thoughts a tumult of relief and gnawing dread. Yet somehow, I'd faced the thing and removed it from my space. To this day, I still feel uneasy at 4:12 a.m., waiting for that persistent squeak to echo down the corridor. My coats all bear faint traces of the wheelchair's metal patterns, and sometimes I catch myself rubbing at a phantom ache in my shoulder blades, as though something had once pinned me there. I've tried to record more footage, but all I get now is static mixed with indistinct murmurs. Friends remark that I've changed, become distant and prone to anxious glances at the clock. They're concerned I've become paranoid, worried that I'm not sleeping enough. And I suspect they might be right, because I often sense that any moment, the old wheelchair could return, wheels scraping across my floors, dragging me back into that seat to finish typing whatever story it demanded I write. Each night I steel myself for the possibility. The memory of its cold embrace lingers on my skin, a warning I can't dismiss. I haven't died. I haven't disappeared. But I sometimes wonder if I'm still entirely me, if some part of me was replaced in that seat, if the occupant behind the veil was slowly supplanting my will. Every night I survive is one more night the wheelchair remains absent, yet the dread remains, ingrained into my senses. Even now, as I listen to the ticking of the clock, there's a quiet terror in me that never seems to fade. I've escaped for now, but my reflection in the mirror still looks off. At times I swear I see a mesh veil flickering across my face in the corner of my vision, or catch a rusted fragment winking at me from the folds of my clothes. And so I wait, every muscle taut with anticipation, hoping the next sunrise greets me without that familiar scrape of metal in the corridor. The weight of the wheelchair's presence might be gone physically, but in the darkest hours I sense it there, lingering in the corners of my mind. And I can't help but wonder if one day it will roll back into my life, leaving a fresh trail of rust that leads straight to my desk, beckoning me to sit and relinquish one more piece of myself to whatever entity or madness resides in its corroded frame. Story 10. I woke up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, with the taste of iron in my mouth. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I could almost swear I felt something brush past my shoulder in the dark. In the faint glow of my bedside lamp, I saw that every door in my hallway stood open at a perfect angle, as though arranged for some ominous ceremony. Their hinges creaked in unison like a twisted chorus, and for a moment, I doubted my own eyes. That was the instant I realized my challenge to the attic. My stupid, defiant banging on those ancient doors had triggered something unspeakable. I live alone in this creaking house I inherited from an uncle I barely knew. All my life, I considered myself rational. The sort of person who needs evidence, who dismisses fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye as tricks of the mind. Yet, from the first day I moved in, I sensed a presence in the attic. The corners up there seemed darker than the rest of the house, and the single window felt too grimy and warped to let any sunshine in. It was the perfect place for dust and half-forgotten secrets. A few days ago, in a moment of reckless bravado, I dared that presence to show itself by slamming the attic door 3 times. I can't recall the logic behind it. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that ghosts, or whatever one might call them, don't exist. Now every night since, I dream of those 6 hooded figures. The first time they appeared in my dreams, they stood in a narrow hallway lit by a row of tall candles. The corridor reminded me of a school, though I have no recollection of ever being in that particular building. A thick hush enveloped the place, as though no one else existed in that entire world. Each figure wore a dark hood, their faces fully shrouded, and yet I sensed an uncanny familiarity. They beckoned me forward, guiding me through doors and around corners I'd never seen before. Their cloaks swished against the floor, creating a soft hiss that sent chills through my spine. The beating of my heart thundered in my ears as I followed, compelled by a force I couldn't understand or resist. When I woke from that first nightmare, I felt a jolt of panic. My chest was tight, my breath came in ragged bursts, and I couldn't shake the disturbing sense that the dream had been more than a simple mental illusion. It was 3 in the morning, and the hallway light flickered as though on the verge of burning out. Every internal door in the house was open, forming an eerie alignment. The old hinges squeaked in a pattern, like teeth grinding in slow unison. I spent the next hour trying to gather the courage to move. The floorboards felt cold under my bare feet when I finally crept down the hallway to close each door. My skin prickled with the notion I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the last door, I could hardly swallow. My throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper. Night after night, the dream repeated with slight variations. Sometimes the corridor in my mind was silent except for the gentle rustle of robes. Other times I heard chanting, muffled, incomprehensible, and laced with a tone that made my stomach roil. Each morning, the same bizarre pattern greeted me. Every door in the house stood wide open, as if responding to some silent command. My nerves were on edge. The simplest house sounds, like the refrigerator hum or the faint ticking of pipes, became sharp jabs to my oversensitive ears. I would spin around, convinced I saw a robe vanish around a corner, but there was never anyone there. On the fifth night, something changed. One of the figures in the dream was larger than the others, and I could feel its stare burning through the hood. It extended a withered hand, offering me a rolled parchment. My skin broke out in goosebumps as I reached for it. The texture of the parchment felt ancient, rough and cold as stone. When I unrolled it, I saw a map drawn in bold, wet ink. I didn't recognize the layout, yet it was labeled with the rooms and corridors of my own house. There was an attic, a living room, a hallway, but there were also extra passages that I had never seen. I jolted awake with a stifled scream, my body slick with sweat. My chest fluttered like I was teetering on the edge of hyperventilation. That sense of suffocation only worsened when I noticed the very same scroll was lying on top of my blanket, corners still damp with fresh ink. The lines swirled across the paper in that same impossible depiction of my home. My stomach lurched with dread as I realized this was real, not some trace of a vanishing dream. My eyes darted around the bedroom, half expecting to see a robed form lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Only silence, and my own labored breathing. I spent the better part of the morning studying that scroll. My fingers trembled whenever I ran them along the drawn walls and hidden corridors. At one point, I forced myself to laugh, trying to shrug it off as a hallucination. But the ink smudged under my thumb, staining my skin with a bizarre blackish-green smear. It smelled of something acrid, more pungent than any ink I've known. Part of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had begun sleepwalking and created it myself. But that didn't explain the style of the script or the odd symbols swirling in the margins. Nor did it explain how the paper felt so old and brittle, like it belonged in a museum. By midday, I decided I had to check the house for discrepancies. The map indicated a passage in the east wall of my study that would open into a second corridor. That corridor, in turn, should lead to a hidden door opening toward a smaller chamber behind the staircase. On the official floor plan, indeed on any rational observation, there was no such thing. The study's east wall was just a solid line of plaster and wood paneling. Yet I couldn't ignore the strange hush that followed me as I moved around the room, or the faint knocking I heard when I pressed my ear to that wall. My heart hammered so loudly that I could feel my pulse in my temples. The dryness in my mouth forced me to swallow hard every few seconds, as though my throat were closing up. My legs shook, threatening to buckle, and I could barely keep my flashlight steady. I tapped along the wall, hoping for a hollow spot, but the entire surface sounded uniformly solid. If there was a hidden door, it was seamlessly concealed. Defeated, I sank onto my sofa and stared at the map again. Then I noticed a detail that made my stomach flip. The layout of the house had changed since I last looked at it. Another route had appeared branching off from the upstairs hallway. That made no sense. I was certain that extra route wasn't drawn just an hour earlier. The ink was still damp, as though freshly applied. Despite my terror, curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the stairs with shaky knees, each step eliciting a squeak that echoed through the silent house. The new route depicted a narrow door between two bedrooms, which supposedly led to a passage going straight to the attic. But I knew my house well. Between those bedrooms was only an old armoire built into the wall, used to store winter clothes. Yet the parchment showed that if I opened the armoire and pushed on the back panel, I'd find a route leading upward. As I reached the upper landing, I froze. Directly across from me stood a brand new closet that I had never seen in my life. My heart dropped, and an icy sweat broke out across my forehead. The air felt suffocating. Everything looked slightly off kilter, as though the hallway had stretched a few inches to accommodate this impossible door. It was made of the same dark wood as the rest of the house, with the same decorative trim. If someone else had walked through at that moment, they might have assumed it had always been there. But I knew better. I approached with reluctant steps, hearing my breath rasp in my throat. The doorknob felt ice cold against my palm. My arm tensed so strongly that my shoulder ached, but I forced myself to turn the knob. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a closet interior that smelled of stale air and something damp like rotting leaves. My flashlight beam swept across the small space, and I saw my winter coat hanging there, the exact coat I kept in the built-in armoire. Confusion and dread merged in my mind, making me dizzy. That coat was supposed to be in a different room entirely, behind a different door. Yet here it was, swaying gently as though it had just been hung. My breath came in quick, shallow gulps, and I stepped closer. Inside one of the coat pockets, I found an envelope sealed with what looked like scarlet wax. My name was scrawled across the front in a jagged, almost frantic script. When I touched the seal, it crumbled, and the flap opened to reveal a single strand of hair. A strand that was unmistakably my own, matching my dark color and distinctive texture. The sight made me gasp out loud, and in that moment I could have sworn the closet walls pulsed, as though the house itself were breathing. I felt watched. The back of my neck prickled with goosebumps, and the flashlight in my hand trembled so badly that the beam bounced erratically over the walls. Nothing else was in the closet, just my coat and that envelope. Yet the space radiated an oppressive energy, a sense that something was crammed inside, leaning in to watch me. The air carried a faint hiss, like slow, measured breathing. I backed out, skin prickling, heart racing, and slammed the closet door. The sound reverberated through the hallway, and in that echo, I thought I heard a whisper. That night, the dream returned in full force. The 6 hooded figures led me through an endless chain of corridors lit by flickering candles. The walls seemed to twist like living things, breathing as I passed. The larger hooded figure moved closer, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest, as though it were trying to speak directly to my heart. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. My nails dug into my palms. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to escape, yet I followed them with heavy, reluctant steps. When I woke, I was lying on the floor in front of my bedroom door, covered in cold sweat. The hallway lights were off, even though I never turned them off at night anymore. The entire corridor smelled stale, as if no fresh air had circulated for days. My throat burned, and each breath rattled in my lungs. I rose on shaky legs, flipping switches in desperation. Light bulbs flickered but wouldn't fully illuminate. The next hours felt like a fever dream. Each door in the house had realigned itself again, forming that perfect corridor that seemed too geometric to belong in an old house. I spent nearly an hour verifying that no new additions had appeared on the parchment, but it was the same as the day before. Then, near the bottom edge, I noticed faint lines. They looked like an extension of the map, leading outside the house. Could this thing be showing me a way to leave? My pulse pounded with a sudden, reckless hope. I hurried to the front door, ignoring the way the floor creaked and groaned beneath my feet. By the time I reached the foyer, sweat was streaming down my back, and my hands trembled so violently that I struggled to grasp the doorknob. But when I yanked it open, I saw no hint of the yard or the street. Instead, I found another corridor, much like the one in the dream. Lit torches lined the walls, their flames dancing wildly in a breeze that made no sense. My lungs felt tight, and the metallic taste returned to my mouth. I can't fully explain what happened next. It was as though I slipped into another reality, stumbling down that corridor while my mind teetered between horror and disbelief. The walls were cold stone, and my footsteps echoed with a hollow, eerie resonance. Everything smelled damp, ancient, almost tomb-like, but I kept walking, drawn forward by the flickering light of the torches. My vision blurred at the edges, my head pounding with each step. The corridor turned left, then right, then spiraled downward until my knees threatened to give out. Each turn felt like a labored breath. I was convinced I would pass out. Abruptly, I emerged into my own living room. One instant, I was in that stone hall. The next, I stood on my creaking wooden floor, blinking under the dim glow of my old floor lamp. My living room had never seemed so comforting or so alien all at once. My heart hammered in my chest, my entire body slick with cold sweat. When I pivoted to look behind me, all I saw was the standard front door, shut tightly against the night. No corridor, no torches, no sign of the unearthly passage I had just traversed. My breathing was ragged, and I felt an overwhelming urge to laugh in sheer panic. For a while I simply stood there, taking deep, shaking gulps of air. Eventually I worked up the nerve to check the hallway again. Everything looked normal, or as normal as it ever was in this cursed place. The new closet remained, though, quietly mocking me from its corner. I realized I couldn't stay in this house any longer. Whatever had taken root here was twisting reality itself, or perhaps twisting my perception of reality. The creeping paranoia ate away at me. I could no longer trust the architecture around me. I even questioned whether these events were happening, or if my mind was fracturing under stress. By dawn, I decided to gather my things and leave. I had no plan other than to escape whatever force was dwelling in these walls. I raced upstairs, shoving clothes into a duffel bag, heart pounding so fiercely that I had to pause every few minutes to catch my breath. My reflection in the mirror looked haggard, eyes sunken and wide with fear. A dust-laden hush filled the air, broken only by the frantic rustling of fabric and my rasping coughs. The sense of being watched grew stronger, so tangible it raised the hair on my arms. That's when I felt it, a subtle shift in the house's atmosphere, like a pressure drop before a storm. The wooden floors creaked behind me. I spun around, but saw only an empty hallway. My throat went dry, my mouth refusing to form words. I could barely swallow, let alone cry out. Then the overhead lights flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw a faint silhouette, a robed figure, standing at the far end of the corridor. My heart skipped so violently that I lurched backward, almost dropping to my knees. When the lights blinked again, the figure was gone. I flung the duffel over my shoulder, but my hands shook too much to maintain a proper grip. The fear threatened to choke me, yet I forced my legs to move. Bolting down the stairs, I refused to look back, sure I would see that silhouette trailing me. I yanked open the front door, half expecting that stone corridor to greet me. Instead, I saw the morning light stretching across the front yard. My vision swam with relieved tears. I practically tumbled onto the porch. The fresh air hit my face in a rush, and I gasped for it like I had been underwater for days. Out on the porch, I glanced back into the house. The interior was cloaked in shadows despite the rising sun, and all the doors stood open in that pristine, unnerving alignment. I had the distinct impression the house was glaring at me, silently observing, as if deciding whether to let me go. My heart drummed so hard that each beat felt like a hammer. In my mind, I pictured those 6 hooded figures waiting just beyond my view, candles flickering in that impossible hallway. Even the memory twisted my gut with terror. Yet I slammed the door behind me and stepped off the porch, my legs almost giving out from sheer exhaustion. A suffocating sense of dread clung to my skin, but I knew I couldn't stay. The morning air tasted raw, carrying the promise that maybe I had slipped the house's snare for now. Still, my body shook with aftershocks of adrenaline, and my shirt stuck to me with layers of cold sweat. I wanted to believe it was over, that I could simply walk away, drive to a motel, and never return. But in the pit of my stomach, I sensed it wasn't that simple. That scroll still rested somewhere inside, along with the presence that guided the hooded figures. I reached into my coat pocket and found that envelope. The scarlet wax seal was broken, and the single strand of my hair gleamed in the early sunlight. My fingers trembled as I touched it, a faint echo of that malevolent energy passing through me. No matter how far I might run, some piece of this cursed house had already latched onto me, embedded in my very being. A numbness spread through my limbs, and all I could do was stare at the house one last time. The windows looked like blank eyes, reflecting nothing of what lurked within. I walked away, uncertain of where I would go, convinced that this ordeal had left a mark on my soul. Even with the sun on my face, I felt cold. The memory of that corridor, those robed figures, and the monstrous alignment of the doors scalded my thoughts. My mouth was still dry, and my pulse throbbed painfully in my neck. Each step felt heavy, as if the gravity around me had shifted. Would I ever truly be free? Or was I destined to relive that dream, to sense those silent, hooded shapes waiting for me behind every door? I don't know if I escaped or merely delayed the inevitable. All I know is that my reality has changed, twisted beyond anything I believed possible. Even now, far from that house, I can't close my eyes without seeing the flicker of candlelight on stone corridors. Sometimes I think I hear the faint creak of hinges lining up just out of sight, or I feel that brittle parchment in my hands. A dread I can't quite name lurks just behind my eyelids. And I suspect that, one day soon, I'll wake up again to find all the doors standing open, a fresh map leading me somewhere else I never wanted to go. The knowledge chills me more deeply than any nightmare could, and it leaves me haunted by the echo of creaking doors, the hush of drifting robes, and the silent vow that they are not done with me yet. Story 11. The first time I heard the barking, I nearly fell out of bed. It wasn't the kind of distant echo you might attribute to a neighbor's dog or a wandering stray. It was sharp, clear, and resonated through the walls of my bedroom as if the animal were right there with me. 4 years had passed since my Labradoodle died, and I had grown used to an aching silence during the night. But at exactly 1:07 a.m., the silence shattered, replaced by a sound that set my heart racing, and the hairs on my arms standing on end. Though my dog was gone, something in this house refused to let me forget him. I still remember the night I had to say goodbye to him. There was a sense of finality I thought I understood, the knowledge that I would never again feel his paws pressing against me, or his warm muzzle nudging my hands for treats. Yet, in the intervening years, I held on to his memory through old photographs and the few chewed-up toys I hadn't had the heart to throw away. Never did I imagine that memory would breach the boundary between life and death in such an unsettling way. In the weeks leading up to the first bark, I had been living a routine existence. Work, grocery runs, the occasional dinner with a friend, then home. My modest house was always quiet, almost too quiet, especially at night. I would read in bed, drifting into a shallow sleep around midnight. Then it began, the beep of my alarm clock at 1:07 a.m., a little mechanical chirp that had never bothered me before, suddenly felt unnerving. Because only seconds after that beep, I heard the bark, short, urgent, and heartbreakingly familiar. It happened again the next night, the same exact minute, the same bark. My heart pounded, sweat dampened the back of my neck, and adrenaline surged through my veins. Each time I found myself clutching the edges of my blanket, breath coming in short bursts, and the distinct impression that I was not alone in the room gripped me. My Labradoodle had always barked at 1:07 for his early morning potty break when he was a puppy. I remembered that routine vividly. But he was long gone, 4 years gone. So why was I hearing this ghostly echo? At first I considered the possibility of a dream or an overactive imagination. But what truly sent chills through my entire body was that my alarm clock began to go haywire. Instead of showing the time, the display flickered and then displayed a single ominous word: busca. In my native language, that could mean search or seek. Regardless of interpretation, it was not a normal clock error. The mechanical beep remained, exactly at 1:07, and right on cue, I heard the bark echo in the hallway. I tried talking myself out of panic, but each night, more oddities piled onto the last. I began to notice faint scratching sounds on my bedroom door. At first, these scratches were nothing more than 3 or 4 shallow grooves in the wood. I assumed it had been there for years, and I'd simply never paid attention. Then, with each passing evening, more marks appeared. One morning, I woke to find the entire lower panel of the door etched with what looked like frantic, repetitive strokes, almost as if a dog had tried to claw its way through. Even more unnerving, these marks formed a shape: the silhouette of a seated dog, ears perked up, waiting. My entire body tensed when I spotted that shape. I felt a terrible hollowness in my stomach, as if I was on the cusp of discovering something I wouldn't be able to unsee. The house itself seemed to react. Floors creaked in the dead of night. Doors that I was certain I had closed before bed were found ajar in the morning. More than once I woke up drenched in sweat, heart hammering like a drum. Convinced I felt a weight at the foot of my bed, like the old days when my dog used to jump on the comforter and curl up by my feet. Yet when I reached out, there was nothing but empty air. My mouth would go dry, and an unsettling prickle would slide up my spine. In those moments, it felt as though I were teetering on the edge of reality. Desperate for an explanation, I installed a frequency recorder in my bedroom. Late one night, I captured the faint, high-pitched howling that I could barely register with my own ears. When I played it back and manipulated the audio by speeding it up, it formed something that sounded like training commands. They resembled the ones I used to use, short and snappy, the type of single-word instructions that had once kept my labradoodle well-behaved. Sit. Stay. Come. My pulse thundered in my ears as I listened to my own recorded voice from years ago, echoing through some kind of spectral filter. That was the moment my paranoia bloomed into full-blown fear. The idea of a spectral presence repeating those commands was almost too horrifying to accept. One night, with tension coiling in my stomach, I decided to obey one of the commands. The recording hissed, and I could make out that singular word: sit. My whole body trembled, but I lowered myself to the floor right there in the hallway. The moment I did, the ground beneath me seemed to shudder, not violently, but enough to make my teeth chatter. Then I felt a presence settle beside me, like a cold, coalesced form of air pressing against my thigh. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't bring myself to move for a full minute, focusing on the slick chill that grazed my arm. There was no physical being there, yet the sensation was unmistakable. My heart thumped irregularly, and each thud reverberated in my ears. When I finally stood, I heard the barking drift away down the corridor, almost as if it were guiding me somewhere. My shoes squeaked against a series of wet paw prints that led deeper into the hallway. Water had pooled in the shape of paws, each droplet shimmering under the faint moonlight seeping through the windows. Yet the strangest part was that the footprints never dried. They glistened perpetually, marking a path toward my old spare bedroom. I followed, each step making me feel like I was descending further into a place where logic had no power. That spare bedroom had become a sort of storage space filled with all manner of forgotten relics, dusty boxes, out-of-season clothes, and old books. In one corner, behind some discarded blankets, I found something I hadn't thought about in years: my labradoodle's favorite chew toy. It was a torn plush shaped like a duck, threadbare and missing an eye. The second I saw it, I felt a jolt of recognition mixed with dread. My heart pounded like a warning drum, but I knelt down and picked up the toy. It was damp, droplets sliding down its surface. It was as if it had been underwater, but there was no source of water in that room. My breathing grew ragged, and the cold sweat on my temples stung my skin. I felt an overwhelming urge to drop the toy, but some compulsion made me hold it tighter. Over the next few days, the house itself started to feel oppressive. Every night the alarm beeped precisely at 1:07 a.m., and each time the digital screen displayed that single word: Buska. I couldn't stop thinking about the meaning. Was I supposed to be looking for something, or was something searching for me? My nights passed in a haze of half-sleep and jolting terror as the barking came without fail, growing louder and more resonant. Eventually, I saw the bedroom door physically tremble under some unseen force. I half expected it to burst open, but it never did. I took to turning on every light in the house after sunset, hoping the brightness would dispel whatever was lurking, but it didn't. Shadows elongated unnaturally, contorting around corners, sometimes resembling the shape of a dog with raised hackles. I caught glimpses in mirrors, distorted reflections of an animal shape that shouldn't have been there. Each time I glimpsed it, I felt nauseous, as though my organs were twisting inside me. My nerves were so raw, even the slightest creak of a floorboard caused a surge of panic. I could feel my own sanity fraying at the edges. I found myself replaying the old audio commands, though I had no idea why. Part of me felt compelled, as if I might unravel a clue hidden within them. Each time I played them, I recognized the bond I once shared with my dog. It was intense, built on trust, but now twisted into something I could no longer comprehend. One command said, "Stay." And the moment I paused the recording, the temperature in the living room dropped drastically. My breath came out in visible puffs. I swore I heard panting behind me, hot breath teasing the back of my neck, even though the air was so cold it made my fingertips go numb. In the faint reflection of the TV screen, I thought I saw a dog's muzzle close to my face, but when I turned around, I was alone. Another command was fetch. I hesitated before playing that one. I stood in the living room, heart racing, a sheen of sweat forming on my brow. I closed my eyes and pressed play. In an instant, the lights flickered, and I heard urgent barking echo through the hallway. I nearly jumped out of my skin, stumbling back against the couch. The barking grew more frantic, and then I heard scratching at the closed door to the spare bedroom. With trembling hands, I inched down the hallway. Those perpetual wet paw prints glistened under the buzzing ceiling light. A sense of dread expanded in my chest. I pushed open the door to find the plush duck toy no longer on the shelf where I had placed it earlier. Instead, it lay at the threshold, damp and ragged. It was as if some invisible force had dutifully retrieved it, fulfilling the fetch command. My knees felt weak, and I nearly collapsed in terror. I had to remind myself to breathe, each inhale shaky, each exhale trembling. That's when I realized the deep nature of what I faced. It wasn't a mere memory or haunting. It was something more interactive, almost intelligent, bound to me by the echoes of old routines. By the sixth or seventh night, I was surviving on minimal sleep, overwhelmed by paranoia. I jumped at every noise, every flicker of light. My heart thundered day and night, leaving me sweaty and tense. Whispers crept into my dreams, if I slept at all. I began to question whether I was truly hearing them, or if my exhausted mind was conjuring illusions. I suspected the house wanted me to embrace this phenomenon, to actually attempt some kind of final connection with my lost companion. There was no rational reason I felt that way, just an unshakable conviction deep in my bones. I decided to confront it. That night, I set my phone to record audio and placed it on the coffee table. I sat on the floor, the old dog toy in my lap, waiting for 1:07 a.m. to arrive. When the alarm beeped, I forced myself to watch the display switch to Buska. The barking started immediately, echoing through the hallway. I could feel every thud of my heart, every shiver along my spine. Cold sweat soaked the collar of my shirt. My pulse hammered against my temples, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called out indirectly, saying something to the effect that I was there and willing to listen if something was trying to communicate. Not a direct plea, but a statement of readiness. The barking quieted, replaced by low growls that formed an eerie cadence, like a message in a language I couldn't decode. A part of me wanted to bolt from the house, never to return, but an inexplicable pull rooted me to the spot. The temperature plunged once more, and a formless shape materialized near the hallway. My vision blurred as tears of primal fear welled in my eyes. The silhouette was unmistakable, a dog shape, standing still, tail raised as if in cautious anticipation. Its edges flickered like a dying light bulb. I clutched the toy tighter, my stomach in knots. The barking resumed, softer this time, almost pleading. Shaken and desperate for a resolution, I gently slid the toy across the floor toward the silhouette, my hands trembling so severely that I nearly dropped it. The figure seemed to bend down, sniffing or inspecting. I felt an immense pressure in the air, like a vacuum pulling at my lungs. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure receded, leaving the toy behind. The wet paw prints faded slowly, seeping into the floor until there was nothing but dryness. The alarm let out one more beep, and when I glanced at it, the word Buska was gone. The time read 1:09 a.m. My ears rang in the oppressive silence that followed, my breaths ragged and shallow. The house felt still again, but it wasn't the calm of resolution. It was the silence of something that had momentarily released its hold. In the days since, I haven't heard the midnight barking, nor have I found wet footprints in the hallway. The scratches remain on the door, a permanent reminder of whatever visited me. I've kept the chew toy in a safe spot, unsure whether discarding it might reignite the phenomenon or if holding on to it continues to invite that presence. There's a weighty unease in my chest whenever I pass by the bedroom. Even though the daily horrors seem to have subsided, the memory of that spectral silhouette still sets my pulse racing and my hands shaking. Occasionally, I'll wake in a cold sweat, convinced I heard a faint bark in the distance, or feel a gentle shift on the bed as though a familiar companion were curling up beside me. I reach out, and there is only empty air. Sometimes the clock still flickers at 1:07 a.m., but it shows the correct time now, no longer commanding me with that singular, haunting word. Yet I can't help but sense a lingering tension in the walls, a suggestion that something might still be waiting. Perhaps the bond I once cherished isn't satisfied with mere memories. Perhaps it demands acknowledgement, some final act of understanding. I live my life cautiously now, always attuned to the hush of late-night hours. I still have trouble trusting my perceptions. I double-check locked doors, paused recordings, and flickering lights. Some might say I'm paranoid. Others might accuse me of being haunted by guilt. But there are moments late in the evening when I feel a subtle warmth press against my leg, as if a dog is resting its head there. My heart hammers each time it happens, but I don't pull away. I sit in place, letting the ghostly sensation linger. And though I may never truly know the boundaries of what I encountered, I can't deny the uneasy truth. Sometimes the affection we share with those we love transcends every barrier, even death. And what remains may well seek us out in the quiet dark, barking at the stroke of 1:07 a.m., just to remind us it's never truly gone. Story 12. From the moment I moved into that old, creaking townhouse, an unsettling weight seemed to settle around my shoulders. It was as though the walls themselves exhaled a cold breath whenever I passed by, reminding me that I was stepping into a realm shaped by time and secrets. Every corridor had its own cadence, a low hum of ancient pipes, a distant crack of aging timbers, and the faint echo of dripping water that resonated like a heartbeat in the dead of night. That single dripping noise became my persistent companion from the very first evening. I didn't understand it then, but it marked the boundary between the world I knew and something far more ominous. I live alone in this sprawling townhouse, partitioned into several wings. My section has 3 floors, each with a labyrinth of rooms that never quite fit any normal blueprint. The south bathroom stands out as the most peculiar. It's tucked away at the far end of a narrow hallway and overlooks a neglected courtyard. The first night I decided to sleep here, I heard the faucet in that bathroom turn on by itself at precisely 2:14 in the morning. It was so abrupt, so perfectly timed, that I felt a sudden shock to my system, like ice water poured down my spine. I remember lying there, breathing quickly, struggling to decide if I should go check it or hope it stopped on its own. My curiosity, however, proved stronger than fear. With my heart pounding, I forced myself out of bed. Each footstep across the creaking floor felt like it was announcing my approach to someone, or something, waiting behind that heavy wooden door. The corridor was dark, illuminated only by a slice of moonlight filtering in through a thin window at the far end. The air was stale, and the silence around me made each drop of water sound impossibly loud. When I entered the bathroom, I saw the faucet turned all the way on, water streaming into the porcelain sink. I didn't immediately notice anything in the water, only that the metal handle felt oddly cold, even for that hour. I shut off the water. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, as though my outline had become slightly blurred. Then I blamed fatigue or poor lighting. I tried to calm my frantic breathing, but my heart kept racing, and I had to steel myself just to return to bed. The next night, that faucet turned on again at exactly 2:14. This time it wasn't just running water, it was dripping in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I counted the seconds between each drop. 1, 2, 3, drop. 1, 2, 3, drop. The stillness in the townhouse magnified each plink of water hitting the sink. The noise felt like a living thing. When I approached, I noticed something peculiar. The drops formed a thin trail across the ceramic surface, almost like a handwriting of glistening water. Under the ambient glow of the moon, these shapes shimmered with a faint blue light, reminiscent of frost kissed by a winter dawn. I took a step closer. The smell in the air was metallic, tinged with a hint of ozone. I squinted and realized the dripping water was arranging itself into runic symbols, compact, twisting lines that looked simultaneously ancient and menacing. My stomach tightened at the sight, and the back of my neck began to prickle with goosebumps. I had never seen anything like it, yet it felt like a silent message, an invocation of sorts. My breath caught in my throat. It took me several heart-thumping moments to regain composure and twist the faucet shut. The runes lingered a few moments longer, shimmering on the porcelain before fading away. In a brief burst of rationality, I decided to document this bizarre occurrence. My hands trembled, but I grabbed my phone and snapped a few photos of the watery symbols just before they vanished entirely. Then I simply stared at the sink, stunned, trying to convince myself I wasn't hallucinating. Eventually, I retreated to my room, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold dryness of the night air. My skin tingled with residual fear. I didn't sleep well, half expecting that faucet to turn on again at any moment. A few days later, curiosity won out over self-preservation, and I shared the images with a friend who specialized in arcane folklore. He was astonished. He said the symbols resembled certain Nordic vows of servitude, ancient runes believed to bind beings across realms. He didn't speak these words directly to me in person. Instead, he sent me an email full of cautious disclaimers, hinting that some forces were best left undisturbed. I recall my heart thudding as I read his lines. He suggested that the runes were often used to call upon forces meant to serve a master, though the specifics had been lost to time. That same evening, the faucet's odd behavior escalated. I woke once again to the hiss of water. This time all the faucets in the house seemed to come alive. The showerhead in the upstairs bathroom started spraying water with a high-pitched squeal. The kitchen sink was gushing as though it had a mind of its own. Panicking, I ran from one faucet to another, twisting knobs desperately, feeling that biting cold metal beneath my hands. By the time I reached the south bathroom, the drain was slowly backing up, and the water in the sink was swirling in reverse, forming a faint spiral. It had a mesmerizing quality, making me feel momentarily dizzy, as if the water wanted to pull my consciousness into that spiraling current. My heart hammered. My mouth was dry with fear. The pipes in the walls moaned like deep, resonant whale calls, each reverberation echoing through the hallways. At first, I wanted to believe there was a simple plumbing defect, but each time I pressed on that rational explanation, I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, as though my body itself rejected such a mundane excuse. After I managed to shut everything off, a suffocating silence filled the house. I wandered from room to room, dripping water in my footsteps, trying to quell my rising panic. The townhouse felt different, the atmosphere thicker, as if the oxygen was laced with dread. The following morning, I resolved to ignore the phenomenon. After all, what else could I do? I told myself these were just coincidences or illusions. My chest felt tight with the stress of it all, but I tried to stick to normal routines, making coffee, checking emails, tidying up. When I passed a mirror in the living room that afternoon, I noticed my reflection had a certain tension around the eyes, a flicker that signaled how on edge I was. The day was otherwise uneventful. I began to think maybe it was over. But that night, I slept fitfully. My dreams were filled with indecipherable whispers and swirling shapes. I felt cold sweat trickle down my neck in the darkness, heart pounding erratically. The next morning, every mirror in the house was completely obscured with a thick condensation on the inside of the glass, as though it had seeped into the reflective surface itself. It was a disturbing sight. I wiped one mirror with a cloth, only to find the moisture wouldn't budge. My fingertips felt a strange chill emanating from the glass. It was like pressing against an icy barrier, and behind that swirl of fog, I could see the faint outlines of the same runes from the bathroom sink. They were blurred, as if trying to form but unable to fully take shape. The sensation of being watched welled up within me, making my heart flutter with a rising sense of doom. I tried to calm myself by breathing deeply, but it only made my lungs burn with the stale air of the townhouse. My pulse pounded in my ears. The swirling condensation on the glass looked alive, pulsing gently, as though something on the other side was pushing against it. I managed to gather enough composure to tell myself that I was imagining things, that maybe the humidity in the house was causing some chemical reaction. But each time I turned away from the mirror, I swore I heard a faint rasping from behind that wavy fog, like fingernails scraping from inside my own reflection, begging to be let out. Despite my best efforts to avoid confrontation, the patterns of dripping water and runic shapes continued nightly. I developed a trembling dread of 2:14 a.m. I kept track of time with anxious vigilance, my body often reacting before my mind even registered the hour. Each night, I found myself bathed in a cold sweat, struggling to keep my heartbeat under control. The townhouse's old plumbing groaned in anticipation, the pipes rattling inside the walls. A quiet ticking would start, as though counting down to that eerie moment when the faucet in the south bathroom would open of its own accord. I asked another acquaintance for advice. He told me, in hushed tones through a phone call, to be wary of allowing things inside. I took his warning as best I could, but I felt powerless to stop something that seemed far beyond my understanding. I felt the creeping sensation of madness. I wondered if I was truly seeing these events as they were, or if I had become victim to some strange delusion. The environment around me seemed to conspire to reinforce the fear. Floorboards that creaked in the pattern of footsteps when I was alone, flickering light bulbs that cast dancing shadows where there should be none, and that constant sense of being observed, of eyes pressed against my back. One evening, after the usual 2:14 incident, I stood before the mirror in the south bathroom, staring at my own reflection in a haze of moonlight. The mirror was half covered with swirling condensation on the inside, but I could just make out the outlines of my face. Dark circles rimmed my eyes, and my skin had taken on a sallow tint. My reflection appeared disappointed or maybe furious. I felt sure it was urging me to do something, though I had no idea what. My pulse thundered, and a wave of nausea crashed over me. There was a nearly irresistible urge to speak, to address whatever looked back at me. I did not open my mouth, fearing that once I did, some wordless vow would spill out. At some point, I realized my skepticism had fully eroded. I couldn't rationalize the swirling water, the glowing runes, or the reflections that seemed alive. My sense of isolation escalated. I started double-checking door locks, leaning an ear against walls, jumping at every clank of the old heating system. The paranoia drained my energy. By night, I would doze off in restless fits, only to be startled awake by the drip, drip, drip from the next room. The cold sweat on my skin became a nightly torment. Finally, something in me snapped. I decided I could no longer coexist with this phenomena, so I stayed awake, adrenaline coursing through me, waiting for 2:14 to come. The townhouse was silent except for my ragged breathing. When that precise minute arrived, the sink's faucet in the south bathroom turned on all by itself. I heard the handle squeak, the pressurized hiss of water forcing its way through the pipes, and I shuddered. Yet I crept forward. I flicked on a flashlight and stepped into the bathroom. The water dripped in a steady rhythm, forming the runes that glowed an otherworldly blue. My mind felt hazy, my body tense. I could sense something intangible filling the space, weaving itself into the air, saturating every molecule with an oppressive presence. My hands were clammy, heart hammering in my chest. Every muscle in my body was rigid. Summoning what courage I had left, I turned the faucet off. This time, though, I didn't look away as the last few drops trickled down the porcelain, forging the final lines of a rune that looked incomplete. The glow lingered, almost pulsing. My entire being vibrated with the tension of that moment. My breath caught as the reflection in the mirror behind the sink flickered. There, emerging through the condensation on the reverse side of the glass, I saw a faint silhouette, arms raised, palms pressed against the glass as if in silent pleas. In a burst of panic, I lunged for the mirror, wiping desperately at the fogged surface with my sleeve. The glass was ice cold against my hand, painful in its frigidity. My reflection was still there, but behind it lay the hazy impression of those runes etched on the inside. They seemed to pulse with each pound of my heart, and in that chaotic moment, I perceived a single terrifying realization. Something had been waiting in my reflection, yearning to find a way out, using the water and runes as a channel. My mind reeled with a suffocating sense that I stood on a fragile barrier between two worlds. That presence in the mirror was no idle specter. It wanted to break free. The faint scraping inside the glass started again, sending pulses of adrenaline through my system. My throat was so tight I could barely swallow. In a desperate, trembling act, I turned away from the mirror, feeling the presence behind me intensify. The walls groaned with the strain of old pipes reversing flow. A wave of cold air pressed against my back, but I forced myself out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. Over the next hour, I heard the steady drip of water from within, then the quiet hush, as all settled once more into silence. When dawn finally broke, I tore sheets of cloth from my bed and covered every mirror in the townhouse. The sense of oppression remained, but not as strong without those reflective surfaces. I left that day with a single suitcase, heart pounding and hands shaking, uncertain if I would ever return. Even stepping outside into the morning light felt surreal. The ordeal left me hollow, as if I had been pressed between pages of an ancient text and almost become part of its story. I realized then that I might never prove to anyone what happened within those walls. Yet the photos of those watery runes on my phone still radiate a faint bluish hue in every image. The townhouse remains in my possession, at least for now, its old wings holding on to their secrets and their looming presence. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine I can hear the watery hum of pipes and the faint scrape of something tapping from the far reaches of the glass. And I shudder, recalling how, in that final glimpse, I felt the boundary between reality and nightmare thinning, teetering on the edge of dissolution. I do not know if I'll ever be free from the sense that something followed me, or that it still watches from within that reflection, trapped but yearning. Although I managed to leave, I can't rid myself of the crawling sensation that some vow was forged in those dark hours, that the runes might yet fulfill a pact sealed by dripping water under the moonlight. When I close my eyes at night, I see the faint glow of the runes seared into my memory, and I wonder if ignoring them was ever truly an option. Perhaps something has bound itself to me through that ancient, unsettling language of water and reflection, a secret promise that even now, in the hush of the darkest hour, begs to be completed. Story 13. I felt something was off the moment I pulled up to the red light on Navajo Boulevard. The air seemed too thick, too heavy, as though the night itself were pressing down on my car with malevolent intent. My chest tightened, and a shudder rippled through me. Even the streetlights, casting their pale yellow glow, appeared distorted, flickering like dying candles ready to plunge everything into darkness at any second. The distant hum of engines and the occasional blare of a horn did nothing to ease the oppressive atmosphere. Instead, it only emphasized how utterly alone I felt in that stretch of road. That was when I checked my rearview mirror and saw something that redefined my understanding of fear. It was perched on my trunk, glaring straight at me through the glass. Red skin gleamed under the streetlights, and two small, twisted horns curved from its forehead. Its eyes, dark and reflective, seemed to bore into me with a fixed malice that made my heart pound. I froze, my fingers gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It had a wide mouth, neither smiling nor snarling, but the expressionless face seemed more horrifying than any rage-filled grimace could have been. I wanted to turn around to confirm that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fear of making direct eye contact with that thing, or whatever it was, paralyzed me. When the light finally shifted to green, I snapped back into motion. My entire body trembled as I pressed my foot on the accelerator, hoping this creature would lose its grip. At first, the car jolted forward with a lurch, and I heard a grating sound from behind as though claws scratched along the metal. My breath caught, and my pulse thundered in my ears. But a few seconds later, as I gathered the courage to check the mirror again, the figure was still clinging there, unbothered by the rushing wind. I glanced down at the speedometer. It read 66 km/h, an oddly specific number that I remember precisely because the needle simply stopped moving. Instead of climbing higher, the needle trembled at 66. Then, before my eyes, the numbers began to melt, the printed lines dripping like hot wax. I blinked repeatedly, convinced I was hallucinating. But the meltdown continued, the black ink forming rivulets that slithered down the gauge. A sense of unreality struck me, and I let out a choked gasp that fogged up the windshield for a moment. It didn't stop there. A sudden, overpowering aroma of wet earth flooded the interior, as though I had just driven through a field after a heavy rain. The pungent smell made my nose wrinkle. Desperate for some fresh air, I switched on the air conditioning. Instead of the usual cool breeze, a gust of hot, dusty air blasted out, carrying small particles that hit my face. I coughed, struggling not to swerve as dirt filled my mouth and made my tongue feel like sandpaper. Every fiber of my being urged me to stop the car and leap out, but I was terrified that if I did, I'd find that thing in the open, its black eyes scanning me from just a few feet away. I managed a quick glance in the rear view once again, only to find something even more unsettling than before. The creature seemed to be running backward, facing me, its body parallel to the rear of my vehicle, yet its legs did not move. It glided over the asphalt as though pulled along on invisible rails, like an image projected on damaged film. Its head tilted, and I swore I saw a flicker of recognition in its expression, as if it knew I was watching. My breath was ragged, my throat painfully tight, and my hands slippery with sweat on the steering wheel. My heart hammered so violently that I felt each pulse in my temples. I tried to recall every bizarre story I'd heard about cursed roads or southwestern legends that manifested in demonic forms, but nothing came to mind that fit the living nightmare unfolding around me. The dryness in my mouth increased, and each exhale felt like it scorched my lungs. My mind reeled. Could I be dreaming? Hallucinating? I saw a small gas station sign flicker ahead on the right, a weak neon light that sputtered in and out. With my car creeping forward in that zone of unreality, I made a split-second decision. I jerked the wheel to pull into the station. The creature vanished from the rear view the moment I turned, as though it couldn't or wouldn't follow me into the lot. My relief was short-lived. As soon as I parked, I noticed something off about the place. All the main lights were dead, and the building looked deserted. What little illumination existed was provided by the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the pumps. I got out of the car, my legs shaky as if they might give out beneath me. The air was oddly still, heavy with the same earthy scent that had plagued my car. I glanced around, expecting to find a clerk or at least some sign of life inside, but the windows were dark. The entire station felt abandoned. My teeth chattered, not from cold, but from raw nerves that refused to settle. My breath caught in my throat when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door, my face slick with sweat, eyes wide as if I hadn't slept in days. I told myself to calm down, to inhale deeply and exhale slowly. Instead, I inhaled what felt like a lungful of stale air tinged with dust. I coughed, turning back toward the pumps, and froze. The creature was standing a few yards away, silent and rigid, as though it had simply materialized out of the darkness. Its short horns glimmered under the faint moonlight, and I could see a slick sheen on its crimson skin. Panicking, I backed up until I bumped against my car door. My knees nearly buckled. I recall gripping the nozzle of one of the pumps as though it might be a weapon. Adrenaline made my head spin. That's when I noticed the faint sound emanating from the nozzle. Muffled voices speaking in an unfamiliar language, low and rhythmic, like a chant carried on the wind. The hair on my arms rose as I recognized the distinct repetitive cadence of indigenous words, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. It was as if the voices were beckoning me, or warning me, each syllable a subtle rumble that vibrated in my bones. It dawned on me then to check the gas level. Maybe if I filled the tank quickly, I could speed off to the next town, find a crowded area, anywhere away from that desolate station. My hand still trembled as I pressed the nozzle into the gas tank, but no fuel poured out, only a thick, muddy liquid that sloshed and gurgled in the tank. My heart pounded in my throat as I realized it wasn't gasoline at all. The stench of wet soil overwhelmed me, worse than anything I'd smelled before. Then it began to evaporate in sudden plumes of vapor, as though reacting to an unseen heat. My stomach lurched at the sight, and I had to fight the urge to retch. Behind me, I felt a presence closing in. I turned, just in time to see the creature's outstretched hand, a spindly claw with fingers ending in dark nails that curved inward. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost tenderly touching the side of the tank. The moment its claw met the muddy water, the liquid hissed and vanished, leaving only a faint residue on the metallic surface. A wave of dizziness overcame me, and my vision blurred at the edges. The chanting from the pump speakers persisted, now joined by a low hum that seemed to resonate in my chest. I fumbled to unhook the nozzle, every nerve screaming for me to get back inside my car. My instincts were on high alert, but my body felt sluggish, weighed down as though I were wading through ankle-deep mud. The creature's expression remained as disturbingly blank as ever. It didn't snarl, didn't speak. It only observed me with those cold, uncanny eyes. The humming grew louder, and my body vibrated with the intensity of it. My pulse hammered in my neck. I thought about fleeing on foot, but the idea of leaving my car and being trapped in that deserted station was worse than facing the nightmares behind the wheel. Finally, I managed to yank the nozzle out and stumble back into the driver's seat. My fingers shook so fiercely that it took me 3 tries to jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but all the console lights flickered erratically, making me worry the car might cut out at any second. My entire frame trembled as I shoved the gear shift into drive. The station's forecourt, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, a dark, silent enclosure that threatened to swallow me whole. My headlights illuminated the asphalt in front of me, revealing cracks in the ground and random patches of dried weeds. The edges of my vision danced with shadows, but I tried not to look for the creature anymore. It was enough to feel its gaze on me, that oppressive weight in the pit of my stomach. As I pulled out onto the road, the chanting in the nozzle seemed to echo in my ears, growing faint but never fully disappearing, like a distant melody you can't quite place. My breathing turned shallow and rapid, my lungs fighting for every gulp of air. The speedometer was completely unreadable now, the face melted beyond recognition. I had no clue how fast I was going, only that the engine growled under my frantic push on the gas pedal. There were moments when I thought I saw flickers of red in the rear view, but each time I tried to focus, it was gone. My head throbbed with the strain of constant vigilance. The lines on the road blurred under the minimal illumination from the stars and my faltering headlights. I kept going, forcing myself not to stop, even when logic told me I might be driving in circles. Time seemed meaningless. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. My shirt clung to my back uncomfortably. My breath came in ragged bursts. Every so often I swore I heard faint whispers drifting on the wind, a hushed commentary on my predicament, the voice just outside of comprehension. My paranoia soared. I began to see shapes shifting in the darkness beyond the roadside. They might have been cacti or small shrubs, but under my current distress, each silhouette appeared alive, moving with some hidden purpose. At one point, I noticed my phone on the passenger seat. In my agitation, I'd forgotten to even check for a signal. I grabbed it, only to find the screen flickering. The battery icon showed a weird symbol. Nothing I'd ever seen before, certainly not a usual low battery alert. The device buzzed in my hand, and for a second, I thought I heard a scratchy voice whisper my name. My heart leaped into my throat. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me, and I almost lost control of the steering wheel. I dropped the phone back onto the seat. That was when I glimpsed a reflection in the screen. A faint red face with dark eyes staring back. I jerked my gaze away and felt fresh sweat bead on my forehead. I didn't realize I was clenching my jaw until my teeth started to ache. Each time I blinked, I saw the creature's motionless running backward form etched into my eyelids. My breath stuttered as panic threatened to overwhelm my ability to drive. Then, as if emerging from some dream, I noticed a sign for another station just off an upcoming exit. The sign was barely lit, but it offered a faint glimmer of hope. I followed the off-ramp, half expecting the sign to be a mirage. The exit led me onto a narrow road flanked by tall, crooked trees that rustled in the wind. This time, at least, the station ahead had its lights on, albeit dimly. The mere presence of steady fluorescent bulbs made my chest loosen slightly. I pulled up near one of the pumps, bracing myself for more insanity. A flicker of relief crossed my mind when I saw a shadow inside the building, perhaps an attendant. There was no immediate sign of the red creature. My legs quivered as I stepped out, scanning every dark corner, every flicker of shadow. The stench of wet earth had diminished, replaced by the usual smell of oil and stale coffee from the station. A neon open sign hummed softly in the window. The relief was so overwhelming that tears pricked at my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Something in the back of my mind told me it wasn't over, that the chanting and the monstrous silhouette weren't finished with me. I inched toward the building, each step weighted with dread. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Maybe I was hallucinating. Perhaps the stress or exhaustion or something else altogether had triggered these visions. Yet the memory of that scorching dust in my lungs, the melted speedometer, and the muddy water hissing under the creature's touch felt too raw to dismiss as mere delirium. The cashier inside looked up as I entered, though I could only see part of their face behind the counter. My mouth felt drier than ever, and all I could manage was a shaky nod. I didn't even try to explain. I simply placed a trembling hand on the countertop, feeling my fingertips tingle with residual adrenaline. There might have been some words exchanged, polite greetings from the attendant, but I scarcely registered them. My mind was fixated on the reflection in the glass door behind me, waiting to see if a red shape would materialize again. The attendant likely asked if I needed gas, or if I was okay, but I answered in a clipped, hushed tone, barely coherent. I recalled speaking in a forced calm, explaining that I'd had car troubles, though I didn't go into the details. They offered me water. I nodded, raising the bottle to my lips with a trembling hand, nearly spilling it on my shirt. After a minute, I risked a glance through the window toward my car. The forecourt was quiet, bathed in weak fluorescent light. No sign of footprints, no sign of anything red lurking in the gloom. My chest felt marginally lighter. Maybe I'd made it out. Maybe, if I just kept driving, I could leave whatever horrifying experience this was behind. But part of me suspected otherwise, that once you see a thing like that, there's no unseeing it. Whatever shadow had latched onto my perception might be waiting, biding its time until the next moment my guard was down. I stayed in that station for another hour, sipping water, letting my nerves settle. Each second stretched out, thick with lingering tension. My heart gradually slowed to a steadier pace, and the dryness in my mouth subsided a bit. Despite the relative calm, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation at the nape of my neck, as though unseen eyes followed my every movement. Even the hum of the station's soda machine seemed unnaturally loud, as if it were trying to drown out any attempt at rational thought. Eventually, I convinced myself it was time to move on. I thanked the attendant in a halting voice, then stepped back outside. My lungs tightened as I approached my car, half expecting the trunk to be dented or scratched beyond recognition. It looked normal, though. Even the taillights that had seemed so dim before now looked standard. Maybe I would be okay. Maybe I could go home, shower off the grime and dust, and chalk this up to a bizarre episode. The drive away from the station was oddly calm. The chanting in my head had diminished to a faint echo, and I felt more in control of the vehicle, despite the ruined speedometer. I navigated by instinct, eventually recognizing a familiar route that led toward the main highway. The oppressive heaviness in the air lifted, replaced by a jittery unease that tugged at my thoughts. I wish I could say the terror ended the moment I rejoined the highway, that I never again smelled that stifling, earthen scent, or glimpse that red-skinned figure with short horns. But every so often, just when I feel safe, I catch a fleeting reflection in a window or sense a pungent odor of wet soil invading my nostrils. My heart races all over again, and my hands shake on the steering wheel. I'm left wondering if my reality is forever altered, if some hidden door has been cracked open, letting that thing slip through whenever it pleases. Even now, nights later, I have trouble sleeping. The memory of that contorted, backward-running figure haunts the edges of my nightmares. I haven't driven back to Navajo Boulevard, and I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes, when the night is too quiet and my mind starts replaying every detail, I swear I hear those soft, whispering voices chanting in a language I'll never understand. And in those moments, I'm reminded that some doors, once opened, can't be closed. The threat, the disquiet, the haunting presence remains, lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce the second I believe I'm free.